Good morning, everybody. Good morning to the special Water Commission meeting this day of November 19th, 2020. Can we please have the first call to order and then have the roll call, please?
This is the roll call. Commissioner Young.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Vice Chair Kilbourn.
Here.
Chair Keller.
Here.
And Council Liaison Smetten. Here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Mr. Heckmark, do we have any changes to the agenda?
Chair Keller, there are no changes to the agenda today.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any public comments at this stage?
No public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have two consent items. One is the meeting minutes. The other one is the limited term water sales agreement with the La Cumbre Mutual Water Company. On the limited term water sales agreement, I did notice last night when I was reading through the document that there's a typo in terms of the financial implications, not the actual final number, but the amount that we're selling is 350, not 3,500. And the price is correct, but it should say 2,400 per acre foot. So if we can make that change to that document, then I think would be okay. Do we have any need for discussion at this point?
I move to approve with the changes recommended.
I'll second.
Thank you very much. Can we do the roll call for the vote?
Yes. Commissioner Young.
Yes.
Commissioner Davis.
Yes.
Vice Chair Kilbourn.
Yes.
And Chair Keller.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much. So we'll move on to the administrative items, and we'll start with the water and wastewater fiscal year 2022 to 2026 capital programs report. Mr. Ward?
I'll start that off, Chair Keller. Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager. And as you may recall, this is a presentation we do every other year in which we are looking out for the next 5 years of capital work. Next slide. So when we do this forecasting, of course, we're looking out to the next 5 years, but of most significance is what's happening in the next 2 years, because that's ultimately what we're looking to incorporate into the budget that council will be reviewing and adopting. This is our opportunity to prioritize funding and identify unmet needs. And you'll notice we do have some of those. And also to kind of identify what the funding sources we anticipate for some of these projects. This year, we're fortunate to have not only the water, the El Estero facilities plan, but we also had the water distribution infrastructure plan done to help, really to help make this document more accurate. And both of those plans looked out 30 years into the future as far as what our maintenance needs, and allows us to have a more stable approach to maintenance of our infrastructure. Next slide. So just the general timing, for those not familiar with how this works, we've been actively working for several months now on putting all this information and entering it into the CIP database, Capital Improvement Program database. And in November, all CIP programs will be taking these to their various boards and commissions to get input and any approvals to move on. And ultimately, this will then be imported into our budget for this next year, which staff are actively working on now and will be finalized by staff sometime in late January, early February, before it heads on to council in May and June. This work will also be presented to the Planning Commission, who will also weigh in on that, and ultimately to the Finance Committee in February before heading to council. Next slide. There are two things I want to mention in this year's CIP before I hand it over to Ms. Blessy to walk through wastewater. Sea level rise adaptation program. You know, we've been working on this. Commissioner Davis has been heavily involved on the sea level rise, and so has Councilmember Sneddon in the development of our adaptation plan. And I think they're hoping to get that approved here in January. I think that's the latest timeline for that. But what I went ahead and did is put in $50,000 for water and $50,000 for wastewater annually for the next five years. So $250,000 in water resources funding is going to be put towards starting to identify what the triggers would be and what infrastructure specifically would be most impacted, and what are some of the options we could implement to address those. So we'll be starting that. Right now we're still working on what the scope might be for that, but we wanted to set aside some funding to recognize that this significant threat is upon us, and we need to start coming up with long-range planning for that. Next slide. The other one that I just want to note kind of flows through a lot of the capital is this baseline capital. What is that? It's really just the smaller stuff. I mean, some people may not think this is small, but changing out pumps and motors, some of those projects can be $50,000 to $100,000. It's kind of just the work that has to be done to keep our system operating. It's not to the scale of some of our $1 million projects, but it's really the bread and butter that keeps our system operating. And so for some of our line items, for example, in water, there's a lot of just baseline capital. And we're not going to spend a lot of time today on that. But if, of course, if the commission has any questions about that, we'd be happy to elaborate more on that. Next slide. With that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Ms. Amanda Flessy, our wastewater manager.
Morning, Water Commission. Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. As Josh has mentioned, my name is Amanda Flessy, and I'm the wastewater system manager, and I'm excited to be presenting for the first time the wastewater capital improvement project budget. Next slide, please. So luckily, my system is not as elaborate as water. We have 7 programs. 2 of them I added this year, the new one, the sea level rise, as Mr. Hagmark mentioned, and then another sanitary sewer capacity improvement program that is going to help support our collection system. And I'll go into more of a detail of that program a little later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. This is our proposed 5-year budget. As Mr. Hagmark says, we propose a 5-year budget, but we are going to concentrate on the 2 years. Next slide, please. These are the 2 years that we will be approving with council, but we do want to show that there is a 5-year plan and there are projects that support these 5-year plans and monies that are needed. Now, we do have a couple of SRF fundings and some unfunded items, and I'll go into those a little bit more into detail later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, these are 2 new programs. I'm excited for the capacity improvement program that'll help support our collection system. Before, we just had a rehab collection system program, and now we're going to be addressing other items for our collection system. And our sea level rise adaptation, which will help support both the treatment plant and our collection system and our lift stations. Next slide, please. So these will go in order as the budget is presented. So our first one is our strategic plan of our El Estero Water Resource Center. This is a planning program, and we use this strategically for our facilities infrastructure plan, our stormwater prevention plans, and what comes out of those planning efforts will go into our either water resource maintenance program or our lift station program. In 23, you'll notice that I've increased this budget. The reason is because our APCD permit, APCD has a air toxics hotspots program that was developed in the 90s. Last time we did a study for this program was in 92. Now APCD is picking this back up and is requiring all of treatment plants and wastewater treatment facilities to start working on these studies again and submit a new study for this. So there's still details to come in, but I wanted to put in the budget to start for that planning. I'm not sure how COVID is going to impact the timing for this, but I want to be prepared nonetheless. Next slide, please. So from those planning efforts come projects, and the projects go mostly into the plant maintenance program. The plant maintenance program has been used to support secondary projects, headworks, in the IPS, the influent pump station replacements. So in the next few years, we are going to concentrate on our chlorine contact chamber, our cleaning and repair of that project, and our hot sludge recirculation project. So next slide, please. Our lift station. So this is a great picture of our pumps at Braemar, and that's one of our lift stations. Unfortunately, Braemar was one of our sacrificial lambs with this COVID budget. So we are moving to submit for an SRF loan next month. Now, the state is a little behind on getting those agreements if we were to qualify, which I believe we are a great contender, and we've done our self-scoring, and I think we have a great chance of getting an SRF loan. However, it does take a year to 18 months to get that loan implemented. So that's why in 23, you'll see a big rise, and that's assuming that's when we'll get the money for the Braemar construction. Now, for the next couple of years, we plan on doing, in conjunction with that, with our self-funding, we do plan on doing some other lift station projects. One of our major one is a Via Lucero force main relocation. We want to get it out of the conflict area of State Street and try to utilize some other areas that are less congested. Next slide, please. This picture is from one of our operators, Ray, who has been with us for 10 years. He is cleaning our sewer lines and helping us keep our sewer lines free so they can go ahead and convey the water as necessary. Now, this new program, our sanitary sewer capacity improvement program, this will help support our collection system. I want to make really clear that we are dedicated to keeping the same amount of monies to our collection system as previously in our consent decree. We're just kind of reorganizing it now. We have identified in a study that we conducted about 5 years ago that we do have some capacity constraints with our wet weather events. We were planning on doing those upgrades in about 5 to 10 years. However, with certain developments in the vicinities of a lot of our capacity constraints, I would like to move this up and start really addressing it. For instance, the Santa Barbara High School, they're redoing a lot of their fields, and we do have a sewer line in that area. And I would really hate for them to do all of their improvements, and then 2 years later, we come in and upgrade our system. That also goes with Ortega Park improvements. They're planning on doing some major improvements in that area, and we would like to be a part of it. So we decided to develop this new program to help be a partner with these other projects. Next slide, please. This picture is our new Bucher recycling truck. very exciting. We finally got our truck. It's been on the road now for the past 3 months, and it's been really successful. Our team has been really excited to have this now. It was a lot of nervousness and pain to get it here, but it's finally here, and it's working out well. So we're pretty excited. This is our sanitary sewer overflow compliance program. This is where this also supports our collection system and our rehab and our repairs of our collection system. We are still completely dedicated to having the amount of monies for the collection system as previously in the consent decree. We're just rearranging it a little bit with the capacity to try to address some of those tight areas, but we are still having our day-to-day, year-to-year rehab projects and point repairs, which will rehabilitate approximately 1% of our public sewage collection system each year. Next slide, please. So this is our electrical distribution system. This is a separate project because it is quite significant. I believe you have seen this before. We are in the final design phases, and we are scheduled to get this project submitted to SRF next month. We do believe we have a very good chance, just like Bravemar will be in the final designs, and we have corrected a lot of our point deficiencies. So we're hoping to get the points needed for the SRF loan. And again, we do, because of the challenges with the state and the SRF loan, we are forecasting that it'll be in the 23-24 time period that we'll get the monies. The reason why I split it up is because the construction will take a few years. So all of the money won't be coming in all at the same time. It would probably be distributed over a 2-year time frame. Next slide, please. I do want to point out, I have identified some unfunded areas. And the reason is because our rates are only for a limited time. These other projects that are now considered unfunded, they were part of our infrastructure plan, and they still are. It's just showing how we need to continue with our rates, and until we get those approved, and we need to really relook at them and make sure that the rates correspond with the escalation of materials and construction, and make sure that it's still viable. But those that you do see unfunded, they were projects that were identified, and we just still need to continue the rate increases after these 5% have been approved for the 3 years. I just want to kind of point that out. That rates will probably still be needed after this approval of the 5% with these 3 years. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight what our total needs are for the next 5 years that we're projecting. We have a significant amount in our SRF loan, as well as our regular bread and butter needs. So and then the unfunded is what I explained before, that we'll have to relook at our rates and make sure they are matching, and we can go ahead and make the improvements that we proposed beforehand. And with that, I am complete with my budget. If anyone has any questions, or if Josh would like to wait till the end, and we can move on to.
Yeah, let's go ahead and field any wastewater questions right now. I think that's good.
Yes, Council Members Nedden.
Thank you, Chair Keller. Just really quickly, I wasn't sure I understood that for the Ellis Darrow electrical upgrade, that's unfunded at this time, or is funded?
Chairman Keller, Councilwoman Sneddon, right now it's unfunded. And it's proposed to be in the SRF loan. So we show it in the SRF loan portion and not in the unfunded,
Okay.
because that is our strategy.
And then with a loan, it would need to be paid back,
Correct.
and that is reflected in the 5-year or beyond budget?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Thank you. We talked so much about the El Estero upgrades, and that one little caught my eye. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Davis?
Actually, 2 comments. One is thank you for including the information. I'm sorry, the budget for the sea level rise planning. As it's really timely, and as far as the committee, Mr. Hagmark's accurate or heading for council, hopefully in January. My 2 little comments are: one, I've never seen the Braemar lift pump pictures. And that, again, drive by that little building all the time. I see that picture and I go, wow.
Yeah.
I know how important that is to our system. I knew how we passed it by, as you talked about. So I appreciated the update on that particular project specifically. And my only other comment, and I'm sure it's going to go for water also, is I just get a little bit frightened by effect upon rates as I see how this goes out into the future. And again, our challenge will be to basically try to meet these needs and balance the impact upon our ratepayers. But anyway, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative for me.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Commissioner Young? I think you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you. Just to follow up, Joshua, on the funding allocated towards sea level rise adaptation, what do you anticipate getting each year from the consultant that you anticipate hiring? What are they going to give back to us?
So what I had envisioned, so we're starting to set aside this money each year. I don't know if we're going to do 100,000 this first year, or we're going to do a $200,000 scope the next year. I do think there's a lot of synergy in doing water and wastewater together, having one consultant look at both of them. Again, this isn't going to solve any of our sea level rise issues. This funding is really going to go towards starting to pull back. What does it look like? What should the triggers be? So, for example, maybe some of the outcomes will go when sea level rise hits, 1 foot above mean sea level, current sea level, you should begin these operations to relocate the, trunk main on the beach. Like, those are the kind of things that we're looking to establish. And then if there's time and money, kind of starting to think about broad scopes of where some of those utilities might go. I am kind of, this is something that's happening across other CIPs. Waterfront is doing the same. And I've said this before, but I'm really keen on staying in step with the rest of the city, because what they decide to do will really impact what we're doing. If we decide, for example, to start building berms on the beach and doing some type of protection, that has impacts on how quickly and what we need to do. So I'm envisioning whatever we end up with here, our consultant is going to be collaborating with whoever the waterfront, maybe even we're joining together with waterfront and parks. Maybe we have one consultant that we're pulling all of our resources together to work on. So at this point, we're still getting our hands around what this looks like, but I felt like we needed to get something on the map and start setting aside the funding, start recognizing this issue going forward. Yes.
That makes sense. And I think it would also make sense if there's other budgets that are allocating funds for the same purpose, that there must be a synergistic effect, positive effect in combining the effort, because it's all related to the same area along the waterfront.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, could I just make a comment to Commissioner Young's comment. You could have been at our sea level rise subcommittee meeting yesterday. This is exactly what we're talking about in terms of looking at it holistically, having a capital improvement budget, which is basically formulated together, working together. And again, Joshua has hit it on the head that in fact, we'll be starting with flood proofing both the sewer line and water lines in a low lying area. And since El Estero will not be moving in the near future, even flood proofing that, at least in the near term. But again, yesterday, the discussion in the report, which will be going to council, I think starting next week and then following up in 2 weeks after that, talks exactly about how we want to see the work effort basically combined into a single budget, if you will, so that in fact it's working, as you say, synergistically. You could have been on our meeting, Jeff. That was perfect.
Well, listen, I would have attended had I known. Are those meetings recorded? So
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. If you go to the city, go to the Sea Level Rise Subcommittee website, and yes, they are recorded, and you can watch it.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, that sounds like a one city approach, which is great. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on.
Great, and I'd like to introduce Mr. Matt Ward of our water system manager.
Thanks, Ms. Plessy. Good morning, Water Commissioners. I'm happy to be here to present to you the Water CIP and answer any questions. Next slide, please. So here are our water system capital programs. You're familiar with them. We have a lot. I'll be presenting on mainly focusing on the ones that are going to have the most impact the budget in the near term, in the 2-year budget, and then also in the longer term. As Mr. Hagmark mentioned, we do have active work in each one of these programs, but some of them are focused on more surgical, small capital, baseline capital type of projects. So with that, we'll be covering the Cater Water Treatment Plant, the desalination facility, our groundwater program, pump stations, recycled water, reservoirs, sea level adaptation, and water main replacement, as well as metering. Next slide, please. So with this table, as you can see on the left, there's all of our programs that I just mentioned. And highlighted in the red box is the 2 years that we're focusing on. And we'll touch more on the outer years towards the end of my presentation here. Next slide, please. So again, focusing on the larger capital projects that we're kicking off, I wanted to start with the Cater Water Treatment Plant program. As you can see in FY22 and FY23, we've got budgeted for baseline capital in FY22, and then FY23, we're kicking off the Cater Finished Water Reservoir Resiliency Project. That project's going to be a multi-year effort, in total around $17 million, and it's going to include adding a second finished water reservoir to the facility, and also addressing some seismic upgrades that we may need to make in the project. So we're looking at designing that second water reservoir, which will be located next to the existing clear well, and then being able to use that facility to take the clear well offline and then be able to perform those seismic upgrades as needed. Also included in the outer years of the budget is $3 million for filter media replacement. Every year we do annual maintenance on our treatment plant, on our filter media, and as a part of that, we're taking core samples. So far, the media is performed as we expected, so that's good. We don't anticipate having to complete that work in the next 2 years, but 5 years out, we're planning to year after year replace filters as they need to be replaced.
Matt, we lost audio from you. I'll go ahead and jump in on this slide anyway. So Desal program, what you'll notice in the budget is we have $700,000 set aside annually. We are anticipating spending that on an annual basis, but it would be kind of rolling and we would be keeping it with the project. You may recall that we have set up a reserve fund for Desal, recognizing that there are going to be expenses in the future, and that funding can be set aside to take on RO membrane replacement, things like that. You will notice there is a spike in 23. What that has to do with, as you may recall, the transition fittings. We had some leaks on the transition fittings when the plant was started up. We were able to reach a settlement agreement with IDE in which they agreed to either make the repairs or give the city $2.5 million towards making those repairs. We've recently gotten Coastal Commission's approval of the repair solution, which we're going to be moving those transition fittings further inland. So they'll be moving up further into the, they call them the dunes area. So it's not out in the beach breakwater area where the current box is now. And so with that, we anticipate potentially about $900,000 in costs that the city might have to add into that project in addition to the $2.5 million IDE will be participating in. So that's what that FY23 spike is all about. And as you're aware, we're continuing on the construction of the conveyance pipeline that should be going out to bid shortly. And we're also making improvements to the pump station at the desal plant so that we'll be able to push water all the way up to the Cater water treatment plant. Next slide.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect time thank you for helping with that slide. That was actually planned despite the audio glitch. So continuing on with our reservoir program, in FY22, we've got some small capital projects that we're working on. As you know, we have 13 reservoirs, and we're currently working on some small projects to address some valves and such that need to be replaced in order to assist us with the water distribution infrastructure plan. And a significant project that we are going to be kicking off is the replacement of Big Trace Reservoir. Design funding is scheduled for FY23 for $4 million. This is a significant project for us. Big Trace site is our second largest reservoir in the city, and it's going to be a storage hub for service to the city on the west side. And as you can see, it's in a residential neighborhood. So we are wanting to get the design kicked off early and a couple years in advance of the actual construction. So you'll see that the larger capital work won't take place until FY26, which in total, the project's going to be around $42 million. Next slide, please. Water main replacement program. Our water mains are the city's largest asset. We have 300 miles of pipe, which serve the city and our outside city folks who are part of our service area. I want to just take the opportunity to thank the commission for helping set the goal with council to replace 2% of the water mains annually. As you can see, we have $9 million budgeted each year approximately to address this need. 40% of the city's water mains are nearing the end of their useful life. So over the next 20 years, we've got plans to replace those pipes. This has been a very important project for maintaining service to the community, and it's also well-timed just in that we moved forward with the Measure C funding for street repairs. And so we've been working closely with our public works staff and streets division to align our water main projects with their projects as best we can, and we've had quite a bit of success there. Next slide, please. Our water meter program, we are moving forward with AMI. We recently received responses to RFPs, and we're currently in the review process, and we're scheduled to wrap that up this spring and award a contract. The total for that project is going to be around $6 million. And then we also have some budgeted facility upgrades for our water meters that'll coincide with the AMI program. So upgrading some of our larger meters in the vaults in which they're in, so that way they can be AMI compatible. And we are still awaiting word on the $1.5 million grant that we had applied for. In addition to the 1.5, or excuse me, we were awarded a $1.5 million grant. And then additionally, we've applied for some additional grant funds to replace other meter components. As you can see, for AMI, we have $4 million budgeted in FY22, and then another $2 million budgeted in FY23 for the AMI project, and also those meter facility upgrades. Next slide, please. So again, here is our proposed FY22 and 23 or to 26 budget. I wanted to highlight just where you'll see the large increases in budget, how they coincide with the reservoir work up at Cater. And next slide. As well as the VicTrace project, which I mentioned earlier. And both those projects will be SRF funded. And the timing of that funding is, as I explained, doing in this case for the VicTrace project, doing the design in FY22 and then following up with construction in FY26. Next slide. And then as you can see, the total for all of this, including our some future needs, is quite a bit. As you recall, we presented on the findings of the water distribution infrastructure plan, which identified about $450 million worth of work that needs to happen over the next 30 years. And as we've discussed, a lot of that work is being front loaded in order to address significant capital needs. So it's going to be a busy time for the water system, and we're gearing up for all this work. Next slide, please. And before we go to recommendation, I'd like to go ahead and open it up for any questions. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. So if we don't have any questions, then we can go ahead and move forward to the recommendation. And
Thank you for the presentation, and good catch there on the glitch. That was good. Commissioner Young?
Yeah, I just have a question. If you could go back one slide. And you may have already told us this, Matt, but if you don't mind going over it again. So what's the plan if the SRF loan funds don't come forward in the amount that you anticipate?
That's going to be a significant, we do anticipate receiving the funds, and this is the plan. So should there be any setback there, then we're going to have to really evaluate when the timing of these projects happen.
So Commissioner Young, Chair Keller, the SRF drinking water program is well funded. And so we don't anticipate there being a problem. It's the SRF clean water, which is for wastewater programs. That is the one that is significantly impacted, and we've been applying multiple times to get funding for the electrical project. So the two different sources of funding, both through SRF, but they're very different funding sources. The drinking water is well funded, and at this time we have no reason to believe. We've already had some initial contact with our staff, with state representatives on that, and we don't anticipate there being any problems there.
And this is money coming from the State Water Board?
It is actually, the funding source is a combination, but I think the majority of it comes from the EPA. So it's a federal.
It's government, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also mention that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What I was going to say is I also just want to mention is that we're maintaining our reserves so that we are able to continually pull for SRF funds when needed for these projects that the infrastructure plan outlined.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So with that, we just have the recommendation before you, which is you receive a presentation. Of course, we're interested in any feedback that we might take with us and pass along as we makes its way to Planning Commission, Finance Committee, and City Council.
Okay. We need a vote on this recommendation. It'd be nice.
Yes.
So, if we could have a motion.
Motion
I'll
order.
move
Steve.
that,
Go ahead, Jeff.
I'll move that we adopt the recommendation.
Second.
Okay,
Second.
can we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Young,
Yes.
Commissioner Davis,
Yes.
Vice Chair Kilborn,
Yes.
and Chair Keller.
Yes.
Sorry,
Sorry,
real
and I
quick,
see that we have public comment, and I didn't see that before the vote. So we voted, but if we have public comment?
Chair Keller, I do not see public comment. Nobody has raised their hand. So I do not see public comment at this time. But there is a question. Hillary Halder had a question. Any questions from the public? And there is no questions right now.
Okay, so no public comment and no question. Okay, right, so we
Correct.
voted, but okay. So let's move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, Part 2.
and I'll start us off. Again, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager, and diving into our second set of 2 sessions where we're going and exploring future portfolios, options, water supply options for the city. Next slide. Just a reminder that our vision is to provide a long-term water security for the city of Santa Barbara, and balancing that with fiscal, environmental, social needs, and continuing a legacy of good water supply planning moving forward. Our presentation today, next slide, we have, since we're taking off from where we were before, we're going to do kind of a quick recap. But some of the questions that we want to touch on today are, do you support the near-term recommendations for drought preparedness? These are the recommendations we went over last time. Is there anything missing? So at the end of the presentation, we'll kind of revisit these 2 questions. Do you support the recommended future water portfolio and the role of desal in that? And so with that, we'll revisit these and we'll answer these right now, but these are some of the big policy level questions we're looking to confirm with the commission today. Next slide. With that, I'm just going to walk quickly through the agenda today. Ms. Corey is going to walk us through just a quick recap of our meeting, our 2-hour meeting last week, going over what those future portfolios were. We're going to turn it over to our friends from WSC to walk us through the triple bottom line criteria scoring and how that lines up with our portfolios. And then we're ultimately going to recap or end on our findings, recommendations, and adaptive implementation plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Corey to walk you through a recap.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark. As you know, my name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the water supply analyst for the city. And I've just got 4 to 5 slides today to do a quick recap of our discussion last week on the future portfolio analysis, or at least part 1 of the future portfolio analysis. Next slide, please. First, we'll start with the recommendations that were made last week for all of our portfolios. And so these are individual supply-based recommendations that are applicable regardless of which portfolio the city decides to move forward with in the future. Starting with water conservation, the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan recommends that we implement the city's water conservation strategic plan and that we carefully track demand moving forward over the next few years. You'll probably recall that the most important factor in terms of where our demand ends up in 2050 in 30 years is how our customers rebound after the drought. So how they begin to use water as we come out of the drought. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that because that really is an important decision point as we move forward through our adaptive implementation plan. For the Kachuma project, you'll recall that Kachuma is one of the city's biggest assets in terms of water storage. And so it's really important that we preserve the ability to store carryover water in the lake. Having carryover water in the lake allows us to optimize our other water sources and prepare for droughts. We also want to be able to store non-project water in the reservoir if possible. This would be things like state water project water or water from Gibraltar Reservoir through the pass-through agreement, which is a nice transition to the Gibraltar Reservoir recommendations. It's really important that we're able to obtain a WARN Act contract from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation for our pass-through water. And you'll recall that one of the key threats to Gibraltar Reservoir is that it's filling with silt, and so we're losing storage capacity in that reservoir. The pass-through agreement allows us to pass through and store some of that lost water in Lake Kachuma, preserving our water rights and supplies from that source. For groundwater, we would like to update our sustainable yield and drought storage estimates, working closely with USGS. And once we have a better handle on a good definition for those numbers, then we'll start to prepare a short annual report that tracks those values and monitors storage and sustainable yield moving forward. From there, we can decide if it makes sense to move forward with a more comprehensive groundwater sustainability plan, similar to those described in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. For State Water Project, the city is going to actively participate with the Central Coast Water Authority on their water management strategy study. This looks at ways for us to better use and optimize our state water project water and looks at options like groundwater banking, storage, transfers, and exchanges. In terms of recycled water, it's important that we update our market study for our current recycled water system. That work was last done in 2009, and it's important for us to understand how conditions have changed since then. There's the potential that we could be providing an additional 200 acre-feet of water per year to our customers, but we need to understand how that market looks currently. And then finally, with potable reuse, we want to update our potable reuse evaluation, both in the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan and the feasibility study, as we get more understanding of what the state regulations are going to look like and conditions might change. That way, we'll be able to better analyze it as a future source for the city. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the 9 theme portfolios that we began to discuss last week. You'll recall that we started with 2 baseline scenarios that really kind of serve as a benchmark for our future portfolios moving forward. The difference between baseline 1 and 2 is that in the second one, we've prioritized desal and state water project over Kachuma water to hopefully optimize some of how our supplies are used. Portfolios 3 through 6 were really developed around themes that came out of our Water Vision Santa Barbara stakeholder group and feedback from the Water Commission. So we looked at specific themes that tackle things like cost, reliability, environmental impacts, and local control of water supplies. Once we did the simulation of those 4 portfolios, we recognized that we were really kind of looking at this trade-off between city control and reliability of our sources versus cost, and that there might be some nuances in between that would be more optimal for us to explore. So 3 more portfolios were developed, including potable reuse, expanded desalination to 5,000 acre-feet per year, and a portfolio that both expands desalination and prioritizes it. This slide just provides an overview of the new supply options that are included in each of the portfolios. So on the left-hand column, you'll see some of those new supply options. There's the higher conservation program, which is above and beyond the conservation included in the Water Conservation Strategic Plan. There's the expansion of desal, prioritization of desal, and then 2 different volumes of potable reuse. And then if you look across the slide horizontally, you'll see the 9 portfolios, and you can see which of these new supplies fall within each portfolio. Next slide, please. So you'll recall this slide from last week. This is a summary slide, and you'll remember that we actually went through each portfolio 1 through 9 and looked at how it performed over the 30-year future time steps. But this slide really just wraps up each of those portfolios. So each column that you see represents one of the 9 portfolios. They're defined on the right-hand side of the slide, and they're numbered about midway in the slide at the top of the number table. And just a couple of things to point out here. If you look at the middle 3 bars, those are the 3 portfolios that include the higher conservation program. So you'll see that the total demand for those over the 30 years is lower because demand's been driven down with that higher conservation program. While the 3 bars on each side of those 3 don't include that higher conservation program. So there's a little bit higher demand at the end of the 30 years. I also want to point your attention to the black and white hashed piece that's at the top of each bar. It's labeled as extraordinary conservation on this slide. As we discussed last week, we could also call this our shortage. And so you'll see that each portfolio has a different level of shortage. And what that means is that when all of the other supply options have been utilized, this is the piece over the 30 years that's left over, where we'd have to ask our customers for extraordinary conservation in order to meet demands. And that would be conservation above and beyond our conservation as a way of life water conservation strategic plan. So that kind of summarizes the simulations we did of the future portfolio analysis. And next we're gonna move into the triple bottom line analysis. So I'm gonna go to the next slide, and we'll pause for a minute to see if there's any questions that you had lingering from last week or anything that's come up today. Doesn't look like we're hearing any questions, so I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to Jeff Seitel, who's gonna take us through the beginning of the triple bottom line analysis.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Corey. Next slide, please. So as we promised last week, now is our chance to do a deeper dive into the triple bottom line criteria scoring for the future portfolios. And so I'll provide an overview of how the process works and preview the results, and then Rob will walk us through each criterion one by one. We'll be able to get into some detailed discussion. Next slide. So as you recall, the triple bottom line analysis evaluates the costs and benefits of each portfolio considering economic, social, and environmental criteria. And for the analysis to be robust and defensible, the TBL criteria should be distinctive. That is that the criteria should help distinguish between one portfolio and another. The criteria should be measurable, so they either quantitatively or qualitatively measurable to determine if they're being achieved. They should be non-redundant, that is, they should be discrete, separate, and distinct. Of course, they should be understandable, and that is, they should be easy to explain. And then concise. We should try to keep the number of criteria to a manageable number, and that helps the analysis be much more robust and understandable and defensible. Next slide. So this slide summarizes the criteria that were selected for Water Vision Santa Barbara in the table on the left. I think if you go one more slide, it'll animate to the right. Yeah, so the criteria that were selected for the analysis are in the table on the left. And the criteria that were considered neutral, that were excluded from the analysis, are on the right. The table also summarizes the priority that's applied to each criterion in our baseline weighting scenario. So in this case, A represents a higher priority relative to the other criteria. C is a lower priority, and B is an average or neutral priority. So Rob will walk through each criterion in more detail later in the presentation. And additionally, Rob will present the methodology and results of a sensitivity analysis we performed to evaluate the impacts of varying priorities on the analysis results. The neutral criteria on the right were excluded from the analysis since they're neutral between the portfolios. For example, greenhouse gas emissions were not considered as to differentiate between the portfolios since the city is moving toward 100% renewable energy. And we would be happy to discuss these neutral criteria during the Q&A if you have any more questions. Next slide. So this slide provides an overview of how the TBL scoring process works. So moving from 1 to 3 across the top, and then down from right to left, 4 to 6. You can kind of follow the arrows there, and I'll walk you through it. So once the criteria were established, the first step is to establish the criteria performance measure. So that is what quantifiable metric or metrics best capture the comparability of the criterion between the proposed portfolios. So next, each portfolio is given a relative score for that criterion based upon the performance measure defined previously, and scores are assigned as high, medium, or low. Then the scores are normalized so they can be weighted and aggregated. And criteria weighting was developed based on input from the Water Vision stakeholder group and input from the city staff and the consultant team. And you saw that in the previous table, the A, B, C. And then the weighted criteria score is just the criteria score, the normalized criteria score multiplied by the weighting. And then finally, the TBL score for each portfolio is the sum of the weighted normalized criteria scores. And that we typically present that in the form of a stacked column, which we'll show you here in a second. So next slide. All right, so this slide shows a summary of the draft results, and we gave you a preview of this last week. So hopefully you're oriented, but I'll walk you through it. The categorized TBL criteria are listed down the left side, and the portfolios are listed across the top, 3 to 9. The colored boxes represent high, which is green, medium, which is yellow, and low, which is orange, scores for each criterion. And then across the top, cost is summarized as cost above the baseline portfolio in millions of dollars. These are 30-year net present value numbers and are based upon planning level comparative cost estimates as we laid out in the cost basis memo, which is included with your packet. So from this table, you can quickly see which portfolios scored better and worse for each TBL criterion. So it's a nice way to summarize the results. But I think the fun stuff is really when we dive into each criterion specifically. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob to provide a more detailed presentation of the criteria scoring methodology and results for each criterion. Rob?
I just wanted to note as we get into this next section, we're going to be going in detail. Feel free to turn your cameras on and ask questions as we go along here. I think that's probably the best way to handle this section. Do you agree, Mr. Saitala, Mauro?
Yes,
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Is Mr. Young?
I have a question. If you could back up one slide. I'm just curious, who developed this triple bottom line scoring method? I mean, is it used throughout the country? Has EPA sanctioned it, or the state of California? You know, it's
Yes.
new to me.
Yes.
Okay.
The answer to all 3 questions is yes. This is a widely used and applied, what I would consider to be state of the industry approach for a holistic view of long-term water supply planning. So in the past, it's typically been presented as a cost benefit analysis. And in some cases, benefits and costs that are non-economic or monetized, and there are strengths and weaknesses with that type of approach. And what we found is in doing this type of analysis as an industry is that this triple bottom line approach is much more effective at capturing some of the costs and impacts that are not necessarily, cannot necessarily be monetized. And it's a very defensible, it's an analytical approach. It can be broken down and looked at a very a discrete level, which is what Rob will walk through. So it's well accepted and as it's well accepted as a standard in the industry for this type of planning. It's used by the state of California, by EPA, and by many municipalities and localities just like you guys.
That's great. That answers my question. I just was concerned about where it came from because wasn't sure whether we were pulling something out of a hat to apply in this situation, because I've never seen it before. But thank you. And then if someone could, at the right time, get a little more in depth with the neutral, I think you call them categories, and as to why
Yes.
you consider them neutral and you're kind of leaving them off. But, you know, when you see fit to do it, that would be fine. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question and comment. And I'd be happy to walk through the neutral criteria here, but Commissioner Davis, do you have a question?
Yeah, just it's a little detailed question. Of course, something just came in and I was on your screen. I'm sorry, the antivirus thing. Down on your energy efficiency, I'm just curious. Again, my first introduction to this also. When you're looking at maximize local control, energy efficiency is low. And again, maximize local control for desal and potable reuse. But then you move over to expanded, either potable reuse or expanded desal, and they both went from low to high. Well, you got essentially the components, but when you break them out, then they go high. I'm just first introduction to it. How do you go from low to high with the same components?
We'll get to
Well, I love
that
that you're-
because some of this isn't obvious until you get into some of the numbers.
Okay, I'll wait.
So, and Jeff,
Yep,
maybe
it's-
we should do the neutral criteria at the end too, because I think they get touched on. Because some of it is neutral, but it's also duplicative if counting in some of these categories. So I think let's go back to it at the end. Yeah.
Sure, happy to. And the beauty, I love that you're thinking on, starting to weigh these criteria and why high, low, why medium, and that's the whole purpose of the next phase of the presentation here. So we look forward to jumping into it with you. So Rob.
All right. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first category is cost. So this is the most straightforward. We did capital debt service, operating fixed costs from 2020 to 2050 with the baseline demand projection. And what's presented here is all the different supplies. So we used a lot of information from the rate study that's going on, and then estimated costs for expanding desal, installing potable reuse, and those little yellow bars at the top for 4, 5, and 6 are for implementing a very aggressive conservation. In this slide, we actually include portfolio 1 and 2 just for comparison. That's portfolio 1's basically the cost if you don't do anything in the near term, and so it gives just a little perspective. So the numbers we carried forward are basically the total number at the top minus the total cost for portfolio 1. And then we did use that to get a normalized score. And going back to one of Dakota's slides where you've got basically the new supplies for each of these, you can see that for the most part, the existing supplies are pretty similar costs for everybody. We're using a pretty similar amount. It goes up and down a little bit, but it's really the cost of investing in desal, operating desal, or investing in potable reuse and operating potable reuse, and then the higher conservation. Yes.
Repeat what you just said about the number there is the number minus the base supply number. I didn't totally
Yeah,
get.
sorry. Yeah, so on the previous slide, if you could just show that real quick. If you're able to go back. Well, so the number we use that we're presenting for the cost of the supplies is, say, for portfolio 3, it's 587 million. Yeah, there we go. And so the number 3, the cost above the baseline portfolio, which is number 1.
Got it.
587 minus 500. Okay. So I think if you go back to the slide we were just on, what you see is just the level of investment in potable reuse, which the purple and like in 1, 2, 4, 8, 9, that's continuing to operate the non-potable system. The purple and 3 and the bigger purple numbers are investing in potable reuse, and number 5 is large investment in potable reuse. And then desal varies because there's a big operating cost in desal, and so some of these expand desal, but it's not operated as often as depending on the other supplies available. Okay, so I'll go to the next slide. And as Joshua mentioned, feel free to just jump in if you have questions. So this is what I was just mentioning, Commissioner. So the difference in numbers, and this is what was carried forward into the scoring. So 1 and 2 were screened out as we discussed last week because it they do not meet the reliability, minimum reliability requirements. But number 4, minimum cost, has the lowest life cycle costs. Whereas number 5, where you're investing in potable reuse, a large potable reuse project, and and then 6 has potable reuse investment and desal expansion have the highest cost. All right, well, why don't we go to the next slide? So the next category is potential for external funding, and really, it's fairly simple in that desalination and potable reuse both have a lot of funding potential these days, and more than conservation does. Historically, conservation had a lot of funding, but there just isn't as much available anymore. So the way we scored this was, if there's both potable reuse and desalination included, then it's high. If there's just potable reuse or desal expansion included, it's medium. And if it's just conservation, it's low. And the idea here is that many of these projects aren't necessarily implemented unless you get grant funding. And so we want to acknowledge that some capital costs can be offset by grant funds, and that some projects are more attractive than others to getting grant funds. Okay, so next slide. And this is speed of implementation. And so this is important because as you guys experienced in the recent drought, being able to bring on a supply quickly when there's unexpected issues, such as a very severe drought or catastrophic event that leaves supplies out for multiple years, you need to move quickly. And potable reuse has some advantages, but moving quickly is not the strength of potable reuse. These projects typically take 10 years to implement. There aren't regulations right now, and frankly, there's so much public health safeguards that need to be put in there. You don't want to go quickly. And I'll just finish this, and then I'll get your question. And desalination, the plant's already built, the permits in place, so it's really designing, building the infrastructure. So it can be done fairly quickly. And conservation is a little bit in between, in that you're really depending on your customers to implement conservation. And so there's a little less reliability there, and certainty to how quickly it could be implemented. Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, just real quick. I get all that. I'm just wondering, because you guys have a bigger view of the world than we do down, or at least I do down here in Santa Barbara. We're looking at a 30-year horizon in that regard, and a lot of stuff's going to happen in the state of California with water use. I've been involved with housing for a long time, and if I went back and said I'd never see the state stepping in to mandate types of actions on potable reuse, what's your sense just going forward that the state's going to start to basically mandate that, in fact, the cities start to look more at potable reuse in order to maximize supply throughout the state?
Well, yes, predicting where winds go, but I will. There have been several attempts already at restricting ocean discharges. I think the general feel from the water reuse community and Aqua and the water community in general is that it makes sense for a lot of people. And some places it doesn't. It's just not, they don't have a reservoir or a groundwater basin, or they've got a great supply already. And so the response is usually that we want help to implement projects such as clear regulations, but mandating the use of it doesn't make sense for everybody. And the people that need it are going to be implementing it, because it's on par with desalination, and those are the two new supplies for California.
Right.
That's really it. And so
I just really wanted your quick take on
yeah.
that. And I think
But having said that, there's been a lot of push to restrict ocean discharges, and that's where it's been showing up of potentially pushing folks.
And that's essentially exactly where I was going with that. So again, you covered both bases for me.
Yeah, and jumping to the end, one of the things we are recommending is to reconsider potable reuse versus desalination once this regulation's out, because we had to build in a lot of assumptions into this.
Yeah, we'll get there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So next slide, please. I just tried to change the slide myself. All right. So reliability during design drought. This is the first criteria in the social group, and besides costs, it's right up there as far as what the purpose of water supply planning, and especially for Santa Barbara, is providing supplies in a drought. And this one was fairly straightforward in that we took the values, and we presented this last week of the years of shortages or extraordinary conservation required over the 30 years and the amount of extraordinary conservation. And it's pretty stark in that 1 years of shortages, it's that 1 year that happens over the 30 years is actually recreating 15 or 16 when there was zero allocation from Kachuma and when there was nothing available from Gibraltar, and making up all that supply is nearly impossible unless you expand your supplies by a lot. And so having some shortages there is okay. The portfolio 4, which did not invest in any new supplies, besides very aggressive conservation, has a lot of years with cutbacks, and so it got low and the rest got high. Next slide, please. So there's a lot here, and I won't try to go through each one because this was an entire resiliency analysis that was conducted, and I'll try to just go by the high-level coverage of this and go with some of the colors here. But what we looked at, which staff has done before and reported on before, is looked at catastrophic events and short-term outages, medium-term outages, short-term is up to 3 months, medium-term is roughly, say, 3 months to 3 years, and then also looked at the long-term scenario of a mega drought, which has been getting a lot of coverage this past year, and looked at the availability of supplies. And the way we looked at this was what supplies are available in each of these scenarios for each portfolio. So the Cater water treatment plant outage, the very first one, most don't score well. And that's because almost every supply, except for desal and groundwater, goes through Cater, even potable reuse. And so I think city already knew this, but that's a very important cog in the water supply chain, and so it wasn't surprising it scored low for most. Now the ones that score the highest have the most local and reliable supplies. So that's the ones 5 and 6 that invested highly in either potable reuse and/or desalination, because the more events that happen, the closer your supply is, and the more reliable, the more drought proof the supply is, the better it performs. Like I said, we can go into this a little more, but are there any questions on this one? The 5 and 6 score the best because of those investments, and 4 scores the lowest because it doesn't have any new supplies. Commissioner Young.
Yeah, I've got a question. So the conclusion, am I muted? No.
No, you weren't.
So the conclusion for each of these, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're going in and out a little.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so the conclusion for each of these columns is at the top.
Yes, I should have pointed that out. Yes.
Okay.
So the top is a little slice of that first table that Jeffrey presented.
Okay, so for number 6, there's 4 yellow mediums, and 3 green highs.
Mhm.
How did you conclude that high should be the conclusion?
Well, it's
Same with number 7. I'm wondering.
right. Yeah, I mean, there's some art to this. It's not all analytical. I mean, so 5 and 6 had the most highs and mediums combined. You know, 3 and 7 both had a low in there. 8 and 9 had a lot more mediums. I mean, if there were, part of this is also simplifying the presentation. There's if we had more categories, if we had 5 categories, it would probably be a little more split. But so I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it kind of does. You know, there's not enough time for us to get into the nitty gritty of what you guys did in coming up with each of these analyses. I'm just trying to get a feel for the big picture, what you did, and just see if it makes sense to me. So, you know, you've answered my initial questions about the whole formulation being something that is kind of peer reviewed and accepted, which I think is great. Now I'd like to know how much you use the word art. So that makes me think that there's a lot of subjectivity to this as well as objectivity. So I'm just kind of wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that and who's involved in actually making these decisions.
Yeah, so as far as the subjectivity versus objectivity, what we laid out the quantitative approach to going from this scoring to high, medium, low. But there is a bit of input from staff and others as far as what that actually means. And, you know, is this group of scenarios, how does that translate to resilience? Someone want to weigh in?
Yeah, I can add some information here. So in terms of the developing the criteria and then establishing the scoring, weighting factors, all of this analytical work was developed internally within WSC with significant peer review. So we had a team of quality control review that questioned and probed and prodded at the criteria the way they were set, and ultimately came to the conclusions that are represented in the report. So it's definitely not, these aren't, every value that you see here was contemplated and challenged and tested before it was finalized. I think what Rob was getting at when he said there's an art to this is that to the extent possible, we've tried to quantify everything. And that goes back to what I laid out in the slide early on. How do you know if you've got effective criteria? Well, they need to be differentiated. They need to be quantifiable. And those tests we apply to these criteria. But even with that work, some steps of these analysis do require some professional judgment. And so this is what we do for a living. We do water supply planning all across the Western US. And so we apply our knowledge of the regulatory environment, our knowledge of the infrastructure requirements, the institutional requirements, our experience in some of these events that are shown here, to really apply that professional judgment to assign scoring. And then the methodology plays out from there. And to the extent that we can, we make it very quantified. And to the extent that we can't quantify, we have to use our professional judgment.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, and then in the end, I'd like to hear staff obviously received your report. And I'd like to know what staff thought about it, and if they went through some kind of internal deliberation where they wanted it modified in any way. Or were they so involved at the tail end of it that what came out was a combination of your conclusions and then staff's overlay to those conclusions?
Commissioner,
maybe
you have Dakota talk a little bit about her review, because obviously WSC has their review, and then we're going with it. It's Ms. Taylor, our water supply manager, and Ms. Corey and I, who kind of go through this data as well and check and make sure that it makes sense. And what you've seen here is documents. We've challenged them on some of their results as well, and we've gone back and forth. They've changed our opinion on certain things, and we've changed theirs just based on our experiences. But I think this, this is challenging. So for the first time, we're trying to take into consideration all of these different variables, and some of them are more quantitative, easy to measure, and some are more qualitative. And I think that's where we kind of get into this nuance here of trying to separate out. I think our minimum, you can be confident, I think, here in the high and low, but those are definitely providing a different levels of resiliency. I think it's in the gray areas where you get into the medium, going back and forth. There's kind of trade-offs in here. And this is one of many variables that we're using to try and evaluate. And you'll see when hopefully it'll all make sense when we get to the end. That was really helpful for me to kind of see how this all comes together. And then we kind of play with different weighting, and it'll kind of show you how everything kind of drops out. So nothing's being determined based on this one factor here, but it's taking all of them together and trying to use them to ultimately reach the best conclusion that we can.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Commissioner Davis?
Okay, great. We're just a detailed question. Under the short-term outage scenarios, the third one, potable reuse outage across the thing. What is that?
Well, there's a lot that goes into producing purified water, and any off-spec water needs to be diverted. And there's going to, when we get into direct potable reuse, there's going to be a lot of monitoring and a lot that goes into it. And those are short-term outages to the supply for various reasons.
Commissioner Davis, I'll give you a good example. Every so often we have an upset at El Estero. We have no idea where it came from. Somebody put something in the wastewater system that doesn't belong in there, and it had an impact on our bacteria. Those are times when this system would shut off and we would not be treating that water for drinking water, right, in a potable reuse situation. And so we need to expect things like that. Even storm flows are going to be difficult for us to take and treat. And so recognizing that you're going to have that variability, we wanted to kind of try and capture that in potable reuse. It has its trade-offs. We haven't really got into talking about those, but at some point we definitely, as that technology and the regulations get closer, we can talk about that whole concept of starting to monitor the collection system so that we get an early indication of something unusual being dumped into the system.
Yeah, I guess I just reacting to we're talking about catastrophic event, right? And I just didn't understand how little events. I understand what you're talking about there and periodic events, but a catastrophic event in the potable reuse outage wouldn't affect the major supply aspects of all the other supplies. That's where I was kind of not understanding how potable reuse outage played across all of the different scenarios. I was a little lost as to how a catastrophic event of losing basically reuse water, recycle water to landscape basically would affect a catastrophic event.
And this is in these, like for number 5, we're talking about 6,000 acre feet of drinking water that's being produced.
On the individual one where you have potable reuse going into water, into potable water supply, totally get that. I mean, on all the other ones where we're not really doing potable reuse, where it's really recycled water. But anyway, you know where I'm going.
And so we're just trying to capture the sensitivity of each of these portfolios. And that's why most scored high in those. Ms. Snedden?
Thank you. So just, I'll try to make these quick, but the green high at the top, I'm wondering if 6 gets a green high overall because it's addressing the medium term outages and the others that have 3 are weighted more toward the short term outages. So maybe that's why that one
And that's where, going back to Jeff's comment of professional judgment. I mean, we took a cut at this based on the numbers, and then talked with Kathy, Ms. Taylor, Dakota, Joshua about operating the system, because for short-term outages, the system's built to run for several days with the system storage. And so what are their concerns, and what makes them most comfortable, and what makes them most uncomfortable with these portfolios? And I think that's where the high, medium, low kind of ended up.
Thank you. So then I just have the follow-up question. I'm just conceptually trying to understand how maximum reliability isn't the most resilient.
Yeah.
And then like the counterpart to that, the minimizing environmental impacts, how that helps us. I mean, that's the only one in a mega drought that helps us. And I guess just that mega drought line, that really long-term scenario, just across the board there, if you could just help me understand why max reliability isn't our highest in a mega drought, but
I think
how minimum environmental impacts are.
Yeah, so I mean, I think first off, there were the titles are themes that we started with, and we tried to push the boundaries with each of them. And what happens with minimize environmental impacts is it's a high investment in potable reuse. So that's 6,000 acre feet of local supply that's available year in and year out. And then you also still have the desalination plant. So you have a large amount of local available supply, and that's one of the reasons it performs well. We needed to differentiate, because the max reliability could have looked exactly like max local control, and so that part of this is just what's in the actual portfolio. So max reliability only included a moderate investment in potable reuse and the existing
I guess it's just the terminology. Does reliability not mean that you have supply in a mega drought? I guess that's what I would have thought reliability meant. So I don't really get how that's not high. I guess it would help understanding the term reliability. I'm thinking I'm understanding it as long in a mega drought that you would have reliable supply. So it seems it would have to be high.
Yeah, well, so I guess the issue is 3 and 6 could have been the exact same content. To have a maximum reliability, you want a lot of local control, and you know, so it came down to the content of them. I hear what you're saying, that there's some mixed messages calling it the max reliability, and it doesn't score the highest on reliability. Although resilience,
there, but it doesn't, like, conceptually doesn't line up for me. But I can leave it at that as we go forward.
Councilmember Sneddon, it might help too in terms of how you're thinking about it if we differentiate between resilience and reliability. And this is actually a discussion that the project team, city staff, and WSC had a fairly in-depth discussion on. And so they sound very similar, right? Resilience and reliability. But we did try to differentiate them from one another so that we could use them as different metrics. And we look at resilience as the way that a portfolio can perform to things like catastrophic events. You know, like how resilient are you to like an attack or to like something major? Where reliability is sort of day in and day out. When you wake up each morning, is that source ready to perform? Or are these other things that could take it out? And so that might help with the understanding just a little bit.
Very helpful. And I think that should be made clear. I'm sure it will at some point, or maybe a different term, but that's very, very helpful, the change in the terminology. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Commissioner Sneddon, I'd like to add too that when we develop these themes, these portfolio themes, which is what you see across the top, max reliability, min cost, minimize environmental impacts, those are portfolio themes. And then we took that theme and developed a collection of supplies that we felt was representative for that theme and differentiated from the other themes to get a broad view of the city's options. And so one of the graphs that I think is really helpful to really understand that is the graph that Dakota showed at the beginning of the presentation that has the average supplies across the 30-year planning horizon for each of the portfolios. And you can see that, so portfolio 5, which is minimize environmental impacts, you can see very clearly from that pie graph that that portfolio includes a very large potable reuse, a very large investment in potable reuse. And that large investment in potable reuse provides some benefits and some challenges relative to resilience. So really how this analysis works is we use the themes to inform the development of the portfolios. We want the portfolios to be differentiated from one another and consistent with the themes so that we can see a full range of options. And now we're testing those portfolios using these different criteria, and we're being objective with how those portfolios perform, and we're evaluating it. And at the end of the day, the themes are important because they helped us inform how we design the portfolios. But at the end of the day, what matters is how the portfolios actually perform. And that's what we're testing right now through the course of this triple bottom line evaluation. Does that help?
It does. Just real quick on that, what matters from a water supply are those criteria you said, but for public perception, public understanding, for us to be able to defend this to the public, it matters what this looks like, not just what all of the individual line items on that. So that's what I'm speaking to, just the, you have a big map in your mind about where these fit in, but it has to pass the sort of like glance test of making sense in that way when we're making a decision that'll affect rates and all kinds of things. So thank you though, very, very helpful explanation. Thank you.
And that's great informative input. I appreciate that.
I'll move to the next slide. Look like Josh was going to say something.
No, please carry on. I think
Okay.
seeing how this all comes together is really important.
Okay, so next slide, please. So the last category in the social grouping is local control. And all we did here was just add up the available supplies that were available on average over the 30-year simulation, and local being considered Gibraltar, Mission Tunnel, groundwater, desal, recycle water. So so obviously when you talk about minimizing environmental impacts and maximizing local control, the two that invested the most in the in new supplies, you've got a high number there. And I was just trying to recall, we differentiated Gibraltar from, say, Kachuma because it's the city's reservoir versus Kachuma is obviously the Bureau is running it, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is running it, there's other member units, there's downstream interests, there's other things going on there. So this one is fairly cut and dry, and then based on those numbers, we had split up between high, medium, low. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is getting into the environmental category, and I think we've always had we've had a lot of back and forth on this because there is maybe stepping back. A lot of these criteria, we came up with a first cut. We got some input from staff. Then we started the stakeholder process and got a lot of input from stakeholders as far as what was important. And the environment was on the top of the list for a lot of the stakeholders. And so we wanted to capture that. And so there's different ways to capture that. And the balance is that the city is operating the water supplies within all existing laws, environmental requirements, and working with all their partners to ensure the environment is protected. And so, but what we wanted to look at was, well, going above and beyond that. And for this one addresses habitats and wildlife, which are really attributed to surface water use, and with Kachuma and State Water Project. So Kachuma being San Ynez River dominated, and State Water Project being focused on the Sacramento Delta. And so the ones that scored high here had the lowest amount of use of that surface water, assuming that it the city is not using it, then it's available for other uses, environmental uses. And so this one and the next one we'll get to is on ocean water use, which again, the city is operating within the TIR and permits, and it's looking at, well, what if we go above and beyond that? So again, so once you get to these numbers, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think you can argue, going back to Commissioner Young comments, as far as where you cut off the high, medium, and low in that gray area in the middle. But minimize cost number 4 and 7 and 8, potable reuse and expand desal, had the highest use. And that's mainly because in the other ones, desalination was prioritized over Kachuma supplies. And so in that case, there's more Kachuma water stored in the lake, and it's used when needed rather than using the allocation every year. So that's one of the big differences between the portfolios. And then the maximized local control invested even more in potable reuse, and that enabled even less use of Kachuma and state water. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. So protect and enhance ocean water quality. So this is a straightforward metric that we use, which is just the amount of desalination that was produced on average every year over the 30-year simulation period. And again, this is going above and beyond existing requirements. And the high, medium, low is similar to the last one, is an inverse of the use. So number 5, minimize environmental impacts, minimize the use of desal, and really that use is just during the extreme drought periods. Whereas maximize local control invested more in desal to expand desal and is running it year in and year out, and similar to number 9. And so it's using the most amount of ocean desal. And then number 8 expands desal, and that becomes a priority supply. So, so I think that's it for this one. We'll move to the next one, which is permitting or regulatory simplicity. So we touched on this before, but potable reuse is going to be a very complicated and drawn out permitting process, and especially the sooner it may be taken on. Whereas desalination, you guys have existing permits. We put it in the medium category, and this is up for debate just because of the existential risks that desal faces long term, but it's hard to quantify. And whereas in the higher conservation, there is no real permitting or regulatory consideration, so it's fairly straightforward. So I think that's it here. And I don't know if I characterized the desal permitting as properly as I could, but I did my best. Commissioner Young.
Yeah, question on desal, on why it's medium. The city currently has a permit that allows it up to 10,000 acre feet a year. So
yes.
Why, tell me how you reconcile that fact with coming up with a medium classification.
You know, Commissioner Young, I would agree with you, but it seems that every avenue that we go to do any work on that facility or to get anything done, there is not a significant amount of support. We have a lot of community support, but I think as it speaks to the regulators and others in the community outside of our community, I feel like there's not as much support. And so I put that, I feel like medium. I'm not trying to overplay it. We do have the permits to do this, but it doesn't seem that we have a supportive at the state or regional level for desal. Like they're constantly looking for, I think, ways to not support the permits that we have, which is not good place to be in. I don't feel like they're doing that on our other permits that we have on other facilities, but that just seems to be a constant presence.
Where do you see that challenge coming from the state? Which state agencies?
Coastal Commission. So we recently are doing some repairs to the intake structure. We believe we have maintenance and repair permits to cover that. But as a result of that, and I, wholly don't have a big problem with this, but they want us to move those transition fittings further inshore. So they're in the dunes rather than in the beach. And it's going to add another probably $1 million to the cost of those repairs that need to be done. But it's what we had to do to get the permits. So it's just those little things that we keep coming across like that ultimately we got it, but it kind of complicates our efforts.
All right, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't the water board that you felt was, unbeknownst to me, is somehow changing the direction on a permit that's been issued. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. When we talked about supply risks in previous presentations, the desalination regulatory risk was one of them, and this is where we tried to capture that. Okay, so next slide. This is the last one, and then we'll bring it all together here. So energy consumption and energy efficiency. So I've got a couple build slides here just to provide some context, because I know you're very interested in this. So from left to right are rough estimates of energy requirements per acre foot of water. And this, for existing supplies, this is actually from city data from the last few years, and includes from production and distribution. And so it goes from left to right with the recycled water non-potable production to surface water, which is mostly gravity, but you got Cater water treatment plants and distribution costs. And then groundwater actually has a range depending on whether Ortega water treatment plant is operating. So that's an average of production, but it does have a range. Potable reuse, most of that energy is in the reverse osmosis membranes, and also high dose UV disinfection. And then it's actually surprisingly similar to State Water Project, and that comes from DWR, and that all the way up to Kachuma, and then includes the same energy once it's in Kachuma, similar to the surface water supplies. And one thing I'll add for potable reuse is that does include an extra treatment step for direct potable reuse, which is assumed. And I'll finish and let Joshua come in. The desalination use estimates are based on recent data, and then the expansion has slightly higher consumption because it's when you expand it, you need to start distributing that water into upper pressure zones, and so it has a higher distribution cost or distribution energy consumption. Joshua.
Yeah, I was just going to say we actually don't have a meter on recycled water, so it is kind of, I think it's quite a bit higher than that. The electrical for recycled water. We can probably take some time and look a little more into that, but we don't have a direct meter, and so we'd have to do some type of projections. It's probably somewhere in between surface water. I don't know. I'd say it's probably even more than groundwater, just because of the level of treatment pumping that we have to do, and then how far up into the distribution it has to go. So we'll take a look at that again, but I just don't want people to get thrown off why that energy is so low. That is not.
Yeah, thank you.
And then potable reuse is a big unknown. We've asked WSC to really put their best thoughts to where it's going to end up. It really depends on how much of the water you can recover, how much has to be rejected, what level of treatment. We've got RO, AOP, which is the oxidation. You have probably some type of ultrafiltration. So there's a lot of different filtration methods. And then we're also talking about, in our case, taking it up to Laurel Reservoir and then treating it as a surface water supply, which I believe WSC has included those surface
Yes.
water treatment costs. Yes.
I was going up to Cater is a big lift. Literally.
Yeah, but then treating it again at Cater
Yeah.
those are included too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
And thank you for the recycle water. That goes back to the earlier CIP presentation of the electrical upgrades at El Estero, because we basically have one electrical meter, so we can't differentiate what's happening. Okay.
That's right.
I don't know who's first. Commissioner Keller?
Councilmember Snyder, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Is there an analysis of this for how much of that energy consumption is from renewable sources or from non-renewable sources? I think maybe to me what's more important is how much of that energy consumption is contributing to greenhouse gases or how much is not. And that even if it's a projection for when we make certain changes, that would be helpful analysis.
Thank you, Councilmember Snedden, because that was a great segue. We are anticipating, we've shared that with WSC, that in 2022 is what we're expecting to transition all of our water facilities, aside from state water, I should say, all of our city water facilities to 100% renewable. So energy will be important from a financial aspect, but we hope the greenhouse gas contributions will be significantly changed starting in 22. As for the state water project, that's another story. They do like to claim that a lot of that is powered by hydro, which is, I know, a mixed bag of being considered a clean energy, but that's kind of outside of our abilities to control the greenhouse gas contributions associated with that.
Joshua, can I jump in for a minute? Because I actually did this energy analysis and I had several meetings with DWR staff when we were looking at the State Water Project energy usage. And they actually do have a very detailed implementation plan in place to transition their energy use to renewables, just like we do with the city. It's not a 2-year time frame like we're working on in the city, but I do believe it was out to like 2030. And it's not just using the hydropower like you suggested, but it's actually just like us at the city where they're purchasing their energy from, and if they can purchase it from renewable sources, and they are working towards increasing the amount of renewable energy that they're purchasing.
Yeah, they have 100% goal, but obviously it's farther out than you. Commissioner Keller?
Yeah, I would expect that potable reuse at the end may be very close to desalination. I mean, there's a lot of the similar processes, and we're going to probably regulate in a way that is going to require quite a bit of filtration just to make sure that we don't have, significant residuals or of chemicals of concern. So yeah,
Those are fairly good numbers, and the big difference is they both have RO, but the big difference is desal has 30,000 parts per million TDS in the ocean, and the wastewater has 1,500. And so the energy is the force you have to take to remove that salinity. And so those numbers come from a lot of operating plants.
Okay.
And so they're pretty good. And as Joshua mentioned, you guys are also unique. Having to pump it all the way up to Cater adds some energy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then maybe go the other way. One more. Okay, so now this is energy consumption by source. So similar to that cost graphic previously, but you can, it's fairly intuitive, but you can see the portfolios that focus on desal expansion and prioritize desal have the highest desal consumption, energy consumption, and number 5, which has a lot of potable reuse, has a high amount for recycled water. And you can see how the max local control with its investment in potable reuse and expanded desal has the highest. And I'm getting a thing in my ear saying my headphones are about to die. So I'm going to call in just a second here. So I'll go to the next slide, which is these combined and what we use for the evaluation. And so this is on a per acre foot basis. And so this goes back to, I think it was Commissioner Davis's question, is the not very logical conclusion that expanding desal would score in the high category. And this is where if we had multiple categories, we could, it might be in the medium high, but you can see the range in actual numbers here. Okay, so last slide is just the putting all those bars together. And then we go back to the slide Jeff presented, which is the steps we've taken. So now we've gone through the actual scoring of each of these. And so we're gonna take a quick break to see if there's any more feedback, and then we'll go into the actual scoring. So how about next slide, please? Okay. Any feedback right now?
I believe we have some questions or comments from the public, and it may be appropriate for them to be able to make those. At this point, they've been waiting for a little bit. So if we can open it up for public comments or questions.
Yes, Chair Keller, there is one public comment right now. Ms. Hillary Hosler. Hillary, I have unmuted you. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. Interesting conversation. Of course, Heal the Ocean is hammering on the recycled water issue, the not enough use of it. A previous chart showed that the expense is $100,000 per year. I don't know about that. As Rob Morrow said, the potable reuse is really difficult. It's expensive. Santa Barbara is difficult because we don't have the help of surface water or pre-treatment or so. But Santa Barbara produces 1,400 acre feet of recycled water per year. We use 800. We are putting 400 to 600 AFY into the ocean every day, so per year. So I'd like to propose, the problem has to do with the way recycled water is budgeted throughout the city. Each city department has to pay for it and budget it. Parks is on a slim budget, so they've elected to put in artificial grass, even though they have the pipes and recycled water already there. Maybe the answer is to budget recycled water cost and used in the general fund. Wherever the pipes are present, the pipes are enough. We have those. But right now we're putting 400 to 600 AFY into the ocean, which the state would like us not to do. And I don't see why we aren't focusing on that. The recycled water line is just that tiny little purple line at the bottom, and we need to focus on that. Potable reuse is way off and way expensive, and as the city website says, 1 gallon of recycled water is 1 gallon of potable water. So we have 400 to 600 AFY going into the ocean right now that is potable water.
Would you like me to take a stab at that, Chair Keller? Just kind of adding some dimension to that as well. And there was a time actually when we were testing the recycle water facility, when we brought the new facility online, and I recall reaching out to the parks director and saying, hey, I can offer you some free recycled water. We want to put the facility through its paces, and we want to just see if it's operating up to what it's was designed and contracted to do. And Parks director was like, well, that's great, but are you going to also pay for the additional cost of maintaining the landscaping if we put a whole bunch of water in it? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to step into that. So it was interesting because I thought it was strictly just a cost of water issue, but it's also for them a labor issue of maintaining the parks. And you know, I hear what Ms. Hauser is saying. I'm sure Councilmember Sneddon is struggling with that when they're looking at the parks budget, but there is those two competing elements. It's not just about the price of recycled water. It's also dealing with the additional growth and landscaping that comes with that. And I think the Parks Department is also struggling with that. So I don't know that it's, I don't know that it would be a strong move to somehow make recycled water free as well. I think you always want to appropriately price precious resources. But I'm just trying to give some context to the conversations that I've heard around that. The other part that I do anticipate, the La Cumbre Mutual Water Company will be taking up an agreement to buy up to 100 acre-feet a year of recycled water from the city for the next 25 years. I anticipate if their board approves it next week, we will be bringing that to Water Commission in December for a recommendation onto council. So we are trying to figure out how to use more of our recycled water. We certainly would be open to an arrangement with Montecito if they wanted to purchase additional recycled water, but no one's formally asked in that realm. And I think the study as the plan coming together, one of the recommendations is to revisit our plan and study of the recycled water system to see if there is anything is changed in the economics of expansion of the system, or if there's new users that might be able to use that. Maybe Ms. Corey can expand on that a little if I missed anything.
You covered it pretty well, Mr. Hagmark. Our planning was done in 2009, and when we look at the work that's been completed to date since 2009, we've accomplished several of the projects that were recommended in terms of adding additional recycled water customers, but there are still a few that we haven't reached yet. And so the idea would be to reassess the market and those customers and see if it is still cost effective to supply them water. And that would allow us to serve an additional 200 acre feet per year, potentially to customers that are feasibly reached with our current recycled water system.
And I know we've talked about this before, but you know, in the winter, pretty much our El Estero Water Resource Center is the primary recycled water user in the winter. There just really isn't any demand in the system. And, you know, if there was a demand for recycled water in the winter, that would really be a great way to get a lot more value out of our investment in that infrastructure.
Chair Keller, there is one more public comment.
Do we have any other public comments? Sorry.
Yes, one more from Charles Hamilton. Charles, I will unmute you. Please unmute yourself, and I will begin the timer when you begin speaking.
Can you hear me okay?
Kind of.
So you can hear me, Joshua? I didn't hear.
We can barely make you out. It's really garbled.
I don't know what's going on with my computer here. I'm just using a Dell computer. I've got the volume up 100% on my audio. But if maybe I should work on that before I make a comment. But am I speaking loud enough for you to hear me, basically?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll speak as loud as I'll speak louder then. I've had a conundrum in my career dealing with the lack of use of rainwater, stormwater for landscape irrigation. And I'm just wondering, would that fall under your heading, your conservation category? Something that would encourage, promote individual property owners, customers using that source, it's not technically impossible. It's costly in some cases, but it's a conundrum that has bothered the heck out of me ever since I started thinking about why are we using this really expensive purified water on landscape and not so much landscape. So it's a little bit an out of the box thought, comment, but I'm tossing it out there in case you might have thought about it and can address it now.
I'm happy to answer this question. Do you have a further comment? Okay. Okay, so our water conservation strategic plan, which was presented to Water Commission in September, did look at both stormwater capture and rainwater harvest. And what's really tricky about those two water conservation solutions is our climate and our geography in Santa Barbara. And so I know you know, Mr. Hamilton, that when rain comes in Santa Barbara, it comes typically a couple of times a year, and it all comes down at once. And then with our steep topography, it flows down off the mountains into the ocean quickly. And so really what happens with things like rain and stormwater capture is you need a storage solution, because when the rain is available through regular precipitation is not when the landscapes need it. And then in the summer, when we have a lack of rain, that water needs a large area to be stored and to be available at that time. And so the biggest value that we can get from rain and stormwater capture is if individual property owners design their landscape to retain as much rainwater in their soil and their individual landscapes when it hits. And the soil can actually capture it and hold it for quite some time. But in terms of a solution that was sort of implemented at a large scale for the city, it's really not cost effective, because the amount of storage that you would need and the cost associated with that and the land associated with that makes it not cost effective in terms of the amount of water savings that you would get. Hope that explanation makes sense.
All right, I just want to do kind of a time check. We got, I think, like 13 slides to go, and I think got a lot more items that we're going to need input on. So hopefully we can get into that.
Chair Keller, there is still one more public comment from Molly True.
Okay, so we have that public comment.
Molly, I have unmuted you. Please unmute yourself. I will begin the timer when you begin speaking. Oh,
okay,
looks like she, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hi, good morning, Chair Keller and Water Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments on this future portfolio analysis. I'm not sure if this is the best time or if I should be waiting to the end of the discussion of this presentation, but as you've seen in the draft technical memo released by WSC, the expansion of the city's desal facility is highlighted as the alternative for meeting the city's expected future water needs. And Channelkeeper has concerns that the water supply portfolio options presented may have regulatory and legal implications that have not been sufficiently analyzed and incorporated into the technical analysis. We wish to continue highlighting the fact that the environmental impacts of the desal plant were only evaluated in the plant's capacity as a temporary facility in 1991, and then as a permanent water supply facility to serve intermittently during drought periods. And thus the environmental impacts of the desal plant as a permanent ongoing supply or as expanded as suggested in Portfolio 8 have not yet been fully reviewed under CEQA. We believe that revising the long-term water supply plan to incorporate these significant changes of the status of the desal for the city's water supply would likely require a new EIR. Last week's discussion around the impacts of the brine discharge and the intake on the marine environment highlight the types of environmental impacts that would need to be analyzed in a subsequent environmental review. And last week, we also heard that an intake monitoring study alone could cost up to $1 million potentially. A full CEQA analysis required to implement some of the city's portfolio options would have additional associated costs and potential cost of facility upgrades that may be required to comply with state policy. Without incorporating potential regulatory steps and mitigation measures required to change the status and capacity of the desal plant, the triple bottom line analysis may significantly underrepresent the cost of desal expansion. And we strongly urge the Commission to request that such regulatory and environmental costs be appropriately assessed before moving forward with further long-term water supply planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment, and we'll take it into consideration for sure. Shall we move on?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just had to switch to my phone. So, okay, yeah, so let's go one more slide. One more. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the actual scoring. And so I'll just request we wait till we get to the feedback slide, which is just 3 or 4 slides in here. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is just highlighting what you've seen before, our initial baseline prioritization of criteria based on WSC, city staff, stakeholder input. And I'll show the sensitivity analysis in just a sec, which has different weightings. So when we apply these weightings, with A being the highest, and so the A score gets the highest weighting, and C gets the lower rating, I will go to the next slide and see the baseline triple bottom line scoring. So what you see here is across the bottom, portfolios 3 to 9. And we've got a green bar, which is the economic scoring, those 3 criteria, a yellow bar, which is the social criteria, an environmental bar, which is the blue criteria. So switch that. And each of those criteria has an individual score in here, but to simplify it, we combine those together. And what you can see from the top line number, that number 8, portfolio 8, expanding desal, scored the highest of all of them. However, many were close. So noting the just the small change in assumptions can switch by 0.01 or 0.02. You see that many of these score high. So number 3 is the max reliability. Number 5 is high or minimize environmental impact. And 7 is expanding potable reuse. And 9 is expanding desal and prioritizing it, meaning operating it year in and year out. So that's just one viewpoint of it. So the first look is expanding desal scores the highest, but there's some others that are close. So then we're going to go to a sensitivity analysis, which is the next slide, and where we looked at different weightings. And so we took different viewpoints in that we emphasized the economic criteria, and this was the cost above baseline, which really ties into affordability and rate setting. And so it's of the messages we heard from the stakeholders, affordability and environmental sustainability and reliability, those are the 3 top messages we heard. And so that is actually captured in these 3 weighting groups. So the economic emphasis is really about affordability. The social emphasis emphasizes reliability, and the environmental emphasis emphasizes the environmental categories. So with these different weightings, we'll go to the next slide, and there'll be a lot of these graphs. And so this is a lot to take in, and so I'll go to the next slide in just a sec. But you can see that depending on each, so upper left is the baseline. So going to upper right, when you emphasize affordability, number 8, the expand desal, really does separate itself a bit because it is the second lowest cost one, but it also has good opportunity for grant funding and can be implemented quickly. If you go to the bottom left, well, actually, I'll say one more thing on the upper right for affordability. What was surprising in this was number 4, which is minimize costs, actually didn't score well. And that's just from partially from the economic category, which is the green, but also it doesn't score as well in the social category. And so that combined, when it adds up, it doesn't add up. Okay, so now bottom left, the social emphasis. And going back to the discussion we had on reliability and resiliency and local control, this is where minimizing environmental impact actually scored very well. And that was, you can see the yellow bar is the social emphasis number. So 5 and 6 actually scored the same. And what differentiated a little bit is just the environmental benefits of minimized environmental impact. That was the differentiator between 5 and 6. And again, minimized cost scored low. And then on the bottom right, we have an environmental emphasis. And number 5 in the blue bars scored by far the highest. And most of the other ones were in the middle. The lowest was actually maximize local control, and that's partially because it's expanding desal and operating it year round, and also adding a potable reuse plant. And so it's just using a lot of energy, and it's using a lot of desal production. So what's informative is taking this, which again is just a lot of numbers. It is a lot to take in. And going to the next slide, which helps organize it a little bit, which is the rankings. And so this is, since the score changes each time, if you look at the rankings of each portfolio within those scenarios, so on the left is the 4 scenarios, across the top are the 7 portfolios. And this is, jumping to where we're going to get to in recommendations. Expanding desal scores well in all of the scenarios. Minimize environmental impact scores the second most for the most part in the other scenarios, and that just it conveys the benefits of potable reuse. And if you look at the split, baseline and affordability, expand desal scored the highest, whereas minimize environmental impact scored the highest in the social and environmental. And it really is capturing some of the what we touched on last week, which is the pull of cost versus reliability. And minimize environmental impact has high reliability, but it's also one of the highest cost projects. Whereas expand desal was one of the lowest cost projects, but also provided fairly good reliability and resiliency. So why don't we go and go to the next slide? We can get any feedback right now. Okay, if there isn't any, we can jump to the last section. But okay, we got some folks jumping on.
Councilmember Snedden.
Thank you. I have a question back on that last slide. I don't think I understood with the red and the green, and then how that relates with the numbers. If you could just,
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize. I was going a little fast through these, trying to catch up. So green is just the numbers are ranked. It's ranked 1 through 7. So number 1 is the highest ranked, and number 7 is the lowest ranked. And the coloring just goes from dark green as number 1 and dark red as last place, 7. And so it's just to help visually see the ranking. So the greener it is, the higher ranked it is, and the redder it is, the lower ranked it is.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I can pass it to Jeff to get Commissioner Young.
Yeah, just a comment. There's a lot going on in this presentation, and we have the time to invest in trying to understand it. A lot of time. And the public at large, this is just going to go right over their heads at 50,000 feet. And so I just would encourage you where you can make a slide crystal clear and provide some kind of a takeaway from it. I think that would be helpful for the average person to understand what's going on here. And I hope that we see something in the end where there's some simplistic conclusion that condenses all of this material into a flow chart or something so that the average person can say, okay, I kind of get it now. This makes sense. So that's my comment at this point.
Yep, and we agree, definitely. And we're going to City Council December 8th. We also have a stakeholder meeting December 10th. And there would definitely be more simplified graphics and a clearer message. We want to spend the time with you guys so that you understand what's behind the curtain a little more, and that we don't just present a recommendation without going through all the work that's been done. But good comment. Thank you. Commissioner Davis?
I had the same comment as Commissioner Young relative to the public not absorbing. I was holding it to the end, but since we're into comments, and I will still hold it, my larger comment to the end. I want to give this to Joshua to basically be kind of like thinking about it, right? So we have these technical analysis, we're going to have these recommendations, but at some point we need to compile them all into an urban water master plan. And I want to talk about how that basically comes together. So how we take, this is great information, got underneath the hood, really see where you guys came from. But again, I want to talk a little bit about how does it then ultimately get compiled. And again, then the public would basically be looking at something that they can comprehend. So anyway, we'll get back to that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue for the next set of slides to hand to Jeff as we get into recommendations and how we actually implement this.
Okay, so now that we've worked through we've got under the hood, as you said, and we've worked through the nitty-gritty details of the TBL analysis, we're going to walk through the key findings and the recommendations, and then the adaptive management strategy that will come from that. So next slide. So as Rob described, Portfolio 8, Expand Desalination, ranked first or second in each of the TBL weighting scenarios. And Portfolio 5, which is the Minimize Environmental Impacts, consistently ranked the next highest. So they kind of swapped, except for Portfolio 5, when you focus on affordability, it slipped to ranking number 3. But those two portfolios tended to rank the highest through the sensitivity analysis. And the high level finding here is that desalination expansion is preferred over potable reuse for a couple of reasons. One, it has a lower cost. That being said, well, I should say that it has a lower cost, plus from a permitting standpoint, it's easier to permit, faster to implement, and would allow the city to respond more quickly to unexpected conditions in supply or hydrologic conditions that could lead to drought. The companion recommendation here is that potable reuse is still a viable alternative for the city. And what we've based our analysis on is what we know today in terms of the regulatory framework. And really, as time goes on, what this adaptive management strategy will show is that we encourage the city to revisit the potable reuse strategy over time as the regulations become more developed and as information changes. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. And then the other key point that came out of this analysis is just how critical your storage is, especially Kachuma. You depend upon storage to allow you to provide reliable service as hydrology varies over time. So you have seasonal variation in water supply availability and demand, and then you have annual variability in water supply availability and demand. And your storage is really what allows you to provide reliable service through that variability. And Kachuma carryover is a critical element of that storage. Next slide. So as stated previously, desal expansion is the preferred to provide additional supply if demands increase and if supply yields decrease over time as projected. But however, adaptive management will be critical to establish appropriate scope and timing of the city's actions. So for example, a more rapid and significant rebound in post-drought demand could cause the city to move forward more quickly with a new supply. And higher conservation strategies can be evaluated in that circumstance as well. From a supply standpoint, we've established triggers to take action depending upon projected availability of the city's supplies. We'll talk more about that here in a second. And finally, potable reuse should be reevaluated once regulations are finalized and the city has gained more experience with desal plant operation. And these things together really comprise an adaptive management strategy as the city moves forward. Next slide. So what factors affect the recommendations? And there are several variables. One is how rapidly and to what extent the community's demand will rebound post-drought. That's an important consideration. Supply projections, we've looked at risk adjustments to your existing supplies based upon our understanding of what risks those supplies face. And as those incremental changes occur, the city should evaluate where you stand in terms of your supply portfolio and evaluate actions based upon that. And then, so that's looking at incremental changes, and then there also could be immediate changes that could have short-term immediate effects on supply projections. And those are things that we've accounted for in our adaptive planning, but that we can't specifically predict in any given year. So then when we think about triggers really represent those events that would cause the city to take an action. So one potential trigger could be a regulatory action on the Kachuma project. And if there is some reduction in allocation for the city or an increase in downstream release requirements, as an example, those triggers that would be a trigger that could cause the city to evaluate its next step in its adaptive plan. Similarly, the availability of storage in the Kachuma project, if that becomes threatened, that could be a trigger. We talked about the importance of the permittability of desalination, and that could also be a trigger. If there's some concern around permittability of the desal facility in its current form and or expansion, that could cause a trigger for action. And then as we discussed briefly, any changes in wastewater regulations, state regulations related to discharges to the ocean, those regulations could also be triggers for action by the city. Next slide. So it brings us to a key question, and this is a key question that the city posed to us, is what is the role of desalination in the city's water portfolio? And the primary policy recommendation from this analysis is to change desalination operations at its current capacity from an emergency and drought supply to a regular contributor to the city's water supply portfolio. And desalination expansion is the recommended new drought supply with the caveats that I described previously. So these are the key policy recommendations. These are the key findings as it relates to desal, and the adaptive implementation plan will allow the city to evaluate alternatives as time passes and as conditions change. Next slide. So as it relates to the operating regime for desalination, city staff asked us to look at what could be appropriate operating rules, when should the city be operating desal versus perhaps having it in standby. And what we've established are minimum reserve thresholds. And what we mean by minimum reserve thresholds are, what are the primary indicators that show the city's readiness to withstand the next drought? And also, what are the primary indicators to show whether or not the city has recovered from the prior drought? And we think that the best indicators are the level in Kachuma and the groundwater basin levels. So the idea is that setting the city up so that the projected supplies are sufficient to meet demand without desalination, if desalination was put into a standby mode. So the trigger that we set for this was 180,000 acre feet in Kachuma. And that's a number that's a threshold that can be adjusted as conditions change in the future. And then additional considerations for desal the plant needs to be staffed. And so there's a human resource consideration there in terms of hiring staff to operate the facility, how the facility will respond to catastrophic events, other costs and benefits associated with its operation. And what we're suggesting is that the city conduct a desal operations study to really define those variables and considerations so that there's a very clear view. What are the costs and benefits and the trade-offs for operating the facility on a more frequent basis versus a less frequent basis? Next slide. So here's just an example that shows how this threshold will work. So on the left, this graphic on the left is showing desal as a drought supply only. So this is consistent with city's current policy. And what this shows is that the city, if operating it as a drought supply, wouldn't be able to predict whether or not a drought was coming. You wouldn't know until you're in the drought. And that's what is reflected in this graph on the left, is that the desal plant is turned on once the city realizes it's in a drought, and then the city makes up its supply needs with supplemental water and state water to the extent that that's available. And then you can see the water shortage or extraordinary conservation there, the diagonal hatching. Once the drought sort of comes on, if you're not carrying carryover storage or Kachuma storage into that drought, you have that water shortage. And alternatively on the right, and I should clarify that these graphics, the lighter crosshatch is Kachuma carryover. So both of these scenarios show use of Kachuma carryover. But as you can see, if you were to operate desal with the recommendations that we're providing, using that minimum lake level threshold of 180,000 acre feet, you're carrying more carryover water into the early part of the drought. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to withstand the drought without having to purchase additional supplemental water from the state project and without having to face a shortage and asking your customers for extraordinary conservation. So this is an example of the benefit of operating desal really as drought preparedness and drought recovery in addition to providing supplies during the drought. Next slide. So now I want to talk a little bit about the adaptive implementation plan. And what this graph shows is sort of a two-axis approach to adaptive implementation. So the vertical axis, the y-axis, shows demands, and that's total demand for the city. And then along the x-axis, along the bottom there, is the supply reduction. And that really reflects to what extent are the city's existing supplies impacted by any risk or event. And what this allows the city to do is to say, given a current condition, if we have, say, 90% of our existing supplies available and our demand is less than 13,000 acre feet per year, then that puts us in phase one of our implementation plan. And then you can see how that progresses as your supply condition changes or your demand condition changes. So under phase one, that's consistent with existing conditions. The city is in a status quo mode, monitoring supplies and demands, implementing recommendations as we outlined previously, and the desal plant is operating unless the minimum reserve thresholds are met. So as you start to realize supply reductions and or demands increase, you get into phase two. And that's when you begin planning for a new supply. And as demands continue to increase or supplies are further impacted, you're really faced with a choice. And it really depends upon whether or not you're faced with a supply reduction or an increase in demand. But you either implement a new supply or you plan to operate desalination at all lake levels. And then when you move into phase four, that's when you're looking at new supply implementation and operation of desal at all lake levels. And then phase five really represents the worst case scenario where an additional new supply would be required. Next slide. So that's it for the findings, recommendations, and the adaptive implementation plan, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Councilmember Stan, do you have some questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a couple comments. Do we have further public comment?
Do we have, I mean, I was waiting for you to start out, but we could go for public comment at this point. So we could, do we have any public comments at this point?
Chair Keller, there is no public comment at this time.
Okay, so Councilmember Sen.
So I do want to be careful because as council liaison, I don't want to influence unduly this process. But I do just very briefly want to share from council perspective, my personal perspective on when it comes to council, the thoughts that I have in my mind. And I am an individual speaking right now, and different council members will have different views. But for myself, and I'll just make it brief and then I'll sign out of discussion. I would really like to prioritize minimizing the environmental impacts and maximizing resilience. I don't really want to see desal expansion as a priority if we can get there in some other ways. Minimizing environmental impacts, which was the close second. So that's my thinking on that. And as to the recycled water issue that raised by Ms. Hauser, I would really like to see this water used and not released out into the ocean. And just as an aside, I'm opposed to turf, always have been, probably always will be. And if there isn't a use for that recycled water in parks, maybe we can be offering it to school districts, or as Mr. Hagmark mentioned, to Montecito, or to someone who will use it. And I agree with that it really, I would like to see that really in this portfolio, that water is being used over fresh, potable water. So other than that, those are just sort of my overarching thoughts that I'll take into when it comes to council, but I just wanted to share that, and then I'll sign out of discussion.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I agree a little bit with the comments made by Commissioner Snedden relative to the other alternatives, because we've kind of like got a whole ladder of basically how do we get to expand a desal. And while I will tell you in the end, I understand why expanding to 5,000 acre feet basically makes some sense. I still have a problem, this whole concept of somehow, and Jeff, you tried to get it to it in the last graph, of how essentially running desal, we get this water at Kachuma that we get to carry over. So I think the Achilles heel of the entire process is how Kachuma is operated. And I think the whole carryover issue, the regulatory controls, the fish issues, all of that basically, again, is the main thing, which takes me back to Ms. Corey's original slide, the recommendation for all portfolios, right? That Kachuma carryover is a big dog that blinks in there, right? And I think if you just looked at all those recommendations for all portfolios, generally, I think we'd all basically say, yes, there's our priorities going forward. And the thing that it's missing is then what is then how we approach our drought supply. And I would tell you that I think for the public, I think for the council, you're going to have to basically somehow explain this in a different way, or in a more simplified way, of what is our drought response going forward. And again, if you just simply say desal expansion is our drought response, I think you got to build a construct that better explains how and why. Because you got two steps here. Because I think underlying this, if I absorbed it all right, we're basically saying we're going to run desal as a base supply on some level, to be determined on exactly how and why, but we're going to run it as a base supply. We're going to be looking at desal expansion based upon a number of factors, and I think some of those factors have to do with economics, both in terms of what you talked about in terms of the complexity of the process, the staffing, but I also think with the Montecito agreement, how economics come into it long term. I think there's a complex equation there of why that desal expansion to 5,000 acre feet would make sense to everybody. But I don't know that that's the quote unquote drought response in that regard. And again, I think you really need to rethink that. I think the questions of going forward with desal expansion makes a sense from the standpoint of like I say, local control. In that regard, I think it's going to be when you really look at the aspects of the economics with the Montecito Water Agreement, makes some economic sense. I think you've got operational issues, as I've talked with Mr. Hagmart about why a base supply of desal makes sense. But that leads me to how do you compile all of this into an urban water master plan, which explains the policy and the steps going forward in the time frame for doing that to both the council, obviously, and the public. So that's my overall kind of view of where we're at. I enjoyed the presentation. I have to tell you, even as into it that I am, my eyes start to glass over after a little while because it's a lot of information, but I appreciate the presentation that you've made.
Thank you for those comments. One point that I heard when they were making the presentation is to think of it more as drought preparedness. And I think that terminology is the one that we should be pushing more. We need to be prepared. We don't want to respond to it. We don't have the time once we're in a drought, because by that time it's too late. We don't know until we're several years into it. So we just have to be prepared for it. And the more we have a plan that leads us to that preparedness, I think the better it will be. Commissioner,
just a comment to that. I do agree. I do agree with that terminology in that regard. I'm still like the whole question of the Cachuma, the surface level waters of Cachuma, thinking that we're going to be able to store that in capacity, that it's going to make us as a buffer as we go into droughts. I'm still not sold that, in fact, that's the way it operates. I see when we got into, I've gone through 2 major droughts here. What I've watched is that COME and the Bureau basically have clamped down on allocations in a way that, right, even called into question our ability to store a drop of water during those periods of time. So there's just so many unknowns. I fall back on on the old plans that we've had, that the surface waters, right, you use it or lose it. And so that's just my concern. I love the drought preparedness, but I don't see the security in allowing and thinking that the surface waters are going to be there when we need them in a drought. That's my concern. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much. Commissioner Young?
Thank you, Chair Keller. Great presentation, really comprehensive. I can understand how desal kind of falls out at the bottom in a lot of respects. But one concern I have with desal that I want to share with everybody goes towards the unknown environmental impacts that I think we have not completely identified yet. And this is something that arose at the Regional Water Quality Control Board stage when we considered the permit up to 10,000 acre feet. And I don't mind sharing with you the fact that I voted against the city getting the permit, only because I knew the votes were going to be in favor of the permit. I was going to be in the minority, but I wanted to just kind of make a point that I felt that the city should consider doing its own environmental assessment on both entrainment, impingement, and then I'd like to know more about what's happening with the brine discharge on the environment. So I know that the city and the regional board accepted this, relied upon a study done in either Oxnard, Ventura, some 20 years ago on, I believe, impingement and entrainment. And that study, the conclusions from that study were deemed to be appropriate for bootstrapping and applying to this part of the channel of Santa Barbara. And so I would hope if the city does consider moving to 5,000 acre feet, that it have a discussion, at least a conversation on whether it would be appropriate to do the studies that I'm suggesting. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Kilburn, Vice Chair Kilburn.
Yeah, just great job, guys. There's a lot of information there, and there's a lot of different scenarios in this thing. That it's going through them all just kind of makes us all realize like how diverse everything is in our water portfolio, and how many different ways we can look at this. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns in the future, and I think we do our best at trying to predict maybe what we might see. But I think long term, we all know things can change on a dime, and you know, I'm always for being you know, proactive and, you know, making sure that we've got our water supplies you know, solidified for the future. So I mean, everybody on the commission has got great comments, and it's a tough one, but I applaud us like planning ahead and being proactive in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a great exercise, and I think it's really, really useful. Gets us prepared with, you know, these hard questions that we're going to have to look at. And I think the last sentence in this particular slide, adaptive implementation plan, is going to be the key. I mean, it's good to be prepared. Things will change, and we'll be back here in a few years, and we'll say, well, you know, maybe it's a different scenario, and a different regulatory scenario, different conditions. We will have better information or not about the carryover. So many things that could change. So I think, you know, we'll just have to keep our options open, but it's always good to have a plan that's so thoroughly developed that gives us the information that we need to be able to make those decisions as we go forward. Any other questions or comments?
Just one comment, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, please.
I totally agree that the adaptive management aspect of this plan is going to have to be stressed for the public's purposes, and we all know how that is going to play out. It echoes whatever the people have said. There's just one little note that it just stuck in my craw on the proposed minimum water reserve thresholds. The Kachuma storage volume of 180,000 acre feet. And again, I may be way off in just my intuitive sense, but you know, living with Kachuma water and watching that over the last 40 years, there's moments in time when it's over 180,000 acre feet, right? It is most of the time somewhere in the 140, 130,000. Essentially, that choosing that particular threshold basically says that you will run desal all the time. You will hardly ever basically get to the point. I guess that 180,000 really is one which kind of like I say, stuck in my craw. Why that number? Because in fact, it's almost unachievable in my personal opinion.
Chair Keller, Commissioner Davis, let me take a stab at that because I had a similar questions and concerns about that talking to WSC. And it really goes back to how our contract currently is structured with operating the desal plant. So we have IDE Americas who operates our desal plant, and we have to tell them in April of every year what we want them to produce starting in October of that year. So we're kind of 6 months behind, and so when we kind of landed on that number, we looked back at how Kachuma performs, and typically if Kachuma is at 180,000 acre feet in April, by September, October, it's at 150,000. So that was our mindset. If it helps at all, our mindset is that the desal plant would be activated when the reservoir hit 150,000. Unfortunately, the decision making needs to happen 6 months before that, and that's what led us to the 180. And I recognize that. Well, that 180, it's that's pretty full reservoir, but it's how quickly it does drop. I mean, I was reminded by COMB yesterday that if the city right now took the water that we have in carryover out of the lake would be below 100,000 acre feet already, which is just mind-boggling. If the city took out the water that we have now preserved in the lake because of operating desal and because of conservation, that lake would be below 50%. That like, wow, that was quick. It just seemed like that it was in good shape, and now it's already on that threshold, if not for the city and its efforts to try and build and conserve water in the lake.
Mr. Chair, just a comment, and I understand that. I understood that in terms of where the number is and how it basically goes down faster. Like I say, I've watched Kachuma for over 40 some years in that regard. The 180 just seems so high that in fact, again, you start at 170, you get to 130, and at least watching through the previous droughts, agencies have gotten to the point where it was 100 acre feet was essentially where the threshold was for stopping everything, right? So I get it, but there's just something that basically says that it is one where, in fact, if that's the threshold, you've already made the decision you're running desal full time regardless. It seems like the high end of the decision bar that you might take. That was my comment.
Chair Keller, may I
Josh,
respond?
slide? Sorry. Would it help to show that slide where we have every year?
You know, I looked at that. I mean, again, if you're doing it for me, I've looked at that, and again, I'm trying to put together the technical information that you put there, and the management information that I've been working with over the last 40 years. And the 180 just, again, for me, it basically says we're going to run desal full blast all the time, and that just, again, I don't believe that, you know, it was a slight point that I didn't like the 180. Now we're having a larger discussion. It was just a point that I felt like, given my historical work on water on the South Coast here, that 180 is a threshold. That's a high bar, right? Yeah. I can jump high, but I can't jump that high.
Yeah.
It may be good to revisit that number just to make sure that that's a number that we really, it should be considered a threshold.
We looked at, our simulations evaluated the frequency of desal operation given that threshold, looking at the historical record. So we can show that number, and I think the comment is fair that it does indicate that desal is operating a majority of years. And only during wet periods, extended wet periods, does the desal plant come off, does the lake level exceed that threshold. And what we saw based upon the historical record and the simulations that we ran is that 180 is a number where it's a strong indicator of how prepared the city is for an extended drought. And it really signals the availability of Kachuma allocations through that drought. So we looked at frequency of occurrence, we looked at comparing different threshold numbers, what that resulted to in terms of shortages and extraordinary conservation. So we did a fair amount of optimization, and the comment from Commissioner Davis is fair, that what it essentially means is desal is operating more often than not. And the benefit of that, and really the reason for that, is so that the city can withstand that extended drought without significant water shortages.
Yeah, and I'll add, because again, we went through this a lot, but when you get below 120,000 is when the allocations historically get cut, and we went from you can go from 180 to 120 quickly, especially when you talk about being April 1st when you have to make decisions. And so it really is activating desal, being to prepare for a drought, because you don't know if it's going to be a single dry year or if it becomes multiple dry years, and then it's too late. And so that was the rationale. We can obviously have more discussion and give you some more of the numbers behind it, but it has been a big discussion among the team.
Okay, thank you. We have one public comment, so we're going to give Mr. Hamilton an opportunity to make comments.
Yes, Charles Hamilton, I have unmuted you. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. You know, I've been in the water manager's hot seat at 4 water districts starting in 1990 approximately. But I came to the conclusion when I looked at your desal program coming online that the water manager, thank God, there's no other source of water that you can rely on as much as you can the ocean. The other sources of water that you rely on depend on precipitation, which is just not reliable in this particular location. Now, there are parts of the country where it is. It's not reliable there. We live in a semi-arid area. So I came to the conclusion without this amazing, wonderful, multidimensional analysis that reached the same conclusion that I got, that if I'm going to be a water manager sitting in that hot seat, I want reliability, because who wants to be a water manager when you have to tell the public, I'm sorry, we're running out of water. this is not, that's all I really want to say, but there are other things to think about, of course. Again, I appreciate this modeling because it's a scientific data-based approach to the conclusion that I reached without that type of work. So I feel like my intuitive experiential judgment on the value of desalination has been documented. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're done with any discussion. So I think we're ready to move on to the next item. So the next item is the Water Agency's update. And thank you everybody for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Chair Keller and Commissioners. I'm Kathy Taylor, the Water Supply and Services Manager, and I'm here to provide an update on the Lake Cachuma contracts and local water agencies. Next slide, please. So the Cachuma Master Contract, this contract was scheduled to expire at the end of September of this year. And before it expired, a Cachuma Master Contract extension between the USBR and the Santa Barbara County Water Agency had an extension was put into place. And additionally, the Cachuma Member Unit Agreement extension between the Santa Barbara County Water Agency and each of the Cachuma member units, an extension was put into place as well. And negotiations on a long-term Cachuma Master Contract have yet to begin. We are waiting for the USBR to initiate such negotiations. Next slide, please. The Cachuma Master Contract Administration, the USBR issued draft carryover guidelines at the end of July, which proposed capping the Cachuma member unit carryover water at 25% of the prior year's allocation. As Commissioner Davis referred to it as our carryover water is the big blinking dog. It is a big blinking dog. It's very important to us. And historically, we are allowed to carry over our water and bank it, whatever allotment we haven't used. And what the USBR is suggesting is capping that. And this would be a significant change for us. And the Cachuma member units jointly responded to the USBR in August that they requested that the carryover guidelines be rescinded that they were proposing. And the USBR agreed to negotiate the carryover guidelines over the next 2 years as part of the master contract negotiations. So this will be a big issue for us in the upcoming negotiations. The good news is that all the Cachuma member units received 100% of allocations for water year 21. And as Mr. Hagmark mentioned, we have a significant amount of carryover water in Lake Cachuma at approximately 20,300 acre feet. Next slide, please. Cachuma yield study. The USBR must reevaluate the Cachuma project yield per the recent Cachuma project state water rights order. The Santa Barbara County Water Agency had Stetson engineers prepare a yield study. However, the county did not include any of the Cachuma member units in this study, but they did present the study to us, and the Cachuma member units identified many deficiencies with the approach, the methodology, and the conclusions of the study. And the Santa Barbara County Water Agency also shared this study with the USBR in its draft form, which it is currently in a draft form. So in response, the Cachuma member units decided that they would like to perform their own independent yield study, for which the city is taking the lead on this effort. And we have contracted with Woodard and Kern to perform this work. The work, we just had a kickoff meeting yesterday, and we're hoping that the work will be concluded in March or April of next year. And how the costs will be divided up is each CMU will pay what their entitlement percentage is, consistent with the cost sharing practices. Mr. Hagmark?
And just aside, we intend to administer this contract how we would have liked the county to do it. So we will be involving the county and the USBR in our study as we start to work through that, so that hopefully by the time we get to the end, there will be at least joint consensus on the outcome of it. I think that's what really frustrated us about county's efforts, and really not involving us in any of the assumptions that they put into the model, which we feel were missed out on some great opportunities to really make the model something that would work.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in the project kickoff meeting yesterday on the schedule, we have 2 meetings scheduled where we will invite the USBR and the county to attend both, to get their their comments on it. Next slide, please. The COME Operations and Maintenance Agreement. The USBR executed a contract extension on the COME Operations and Maintenance Agreement. The Operations and Maintenance Agreement now coincides with the schedule of the Master Agreement extension, which, as I stated before, expires in September of 2023. The USBR requested a letter of concurrence from NIMS of no negative environmental impacts by the operations and maintenance activities performed by COME. However, NIMS countered with a greater environmental scrutiny of the activities, and the USBR subsequently withdrew its request for concurrence when they saw that a hornet's nest was being kicked up. Next slide, please. And the Central Coast Water Authority's Warren Act contract for state water project water. The CCWA is pursuing a new long-term Warren Act contract with the USBR for storage and conveyance of state water project water in Cachuma. The USBR did provide the CCWA with a draft contract, which had language in that limited the CCWA's ability to store state water project water in Cachuma beyond 30 days. Historically, this language has been in the agreement or in the contract. However, during the drought, the USBR lifted this requirement, and the CCWA is hoping to not have this language in a permanent long-term Warren Act contract. So that's something that they will be trying to negotiate out of the contract. As for NIMS, they believe that storage of state water project water by CCWA, it should be part of the larger consultation for the Cachuma project. We'll see how that plays out. And then CCWA's current contract expires in June of 2022. Next slide, please. The CCWA state water contract assignments. The state water contract is currently assigned to the Santa Barbara County Water Agency. And since 2017, CCWA has been discussing with the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors to reassign the state water contract to CCWA. And recently they sent a letter to the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors requesting that the contract reassignment. And the Department of Water Resources said that they will approve a reassignment once the County Board of Supervisors approves of it. So the next step is to get this on the Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors agenda. And we're not sure if this will happen, but we're hoping.
I was just gonna add, I think there's a role for the Water Commission to play in that. It's been an item that's been bounced around, and unfortunately, I'm not sure why we're not getting the political support. There seems to be unanimous alignment with all the water agencies on this, and our 2 supervisors who represent the city don't seem to be engaged. So it's a real challenge for us. We've been having a hard time even getting it agendized. I don't know, at this point, I'm not hopeful that they will approve the reassignment.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
Would it be appropriate for the commission to write a letter to them?
I would be open to that. I think if you were considering that, I'd like to bring in Councilmember Eric Friedman, he's our liaison to CCWA, and he
Yeah.
has a good sense of maybe where we might be able to apply some pressure. So I think that's a great opportunity there. Maybe Councilmember Sneddon has some ideas as well. So maybe some ideas you all can talk offline about. I think we certainly could use something like that, something to try and reinforce the importance of this to the city.
Right, okay, thank you.
And the Kachuma Conservation Release Board's support of the USBR current activities, they are assisting the USBR on a new biological assessment for Lake Kachuma. And the USBR will be submitting this new biological assessment to NIMS on December 12th, 2020. And the desired outcome is for a non-jeopardy opinion for the steelhead by NIMS. So we're hopeful. Next slide, please. Oh, Joshua.
I was just saying, here for questions.
Yes, and we open that for questions. As you can see, there's a lot of activity that has been going on. Most of it is dealing with contracts that have been expiring and extensions being put into place and upcoming negotiations.
Any questions, comments?
You know, I think Commissioner Davis really hit the nail on the head. I mean, Kachuma serves a very important role to us. There's some really big issues concerning the yield of Kachuma and the carryover that could really push the city's water supply in a totally different direction. And I'm not thinking in a necessarily positive direction either. And so I think it's worth strategizing how we might get the outcome that we're looking for and preserving the flexibility of using carryover and also finding a yield from the reservoir that makes sense. You know, our discussions internally have been more around the idea of, instead of right now there's a flat yield, is kind of starting to really think more about what is the best way to optimize the reservoir. And really what we're talking about is when the reservoir is full, you want to make room for that next rain event. So really having larger allocations and then maybe some step down that really, we can, as water supply managers, we can rely on. We know when that reservoir is at X on this date, we're going to get this. And that has a lot of value to us. The uncertainty is not something I care for. And one of the desires and strengths of DSAL is that certainty, because at the end of the day, we have an obligation to provide water to this community. So I'm hoping we actually come up with a compromise for using Kachuma that really gets the most out of the reservoir for our customers, the cost, the value of that water, but then also preserves and recognizes the environmental issues that we're also trying to protect at the same time.
Thank you. What's the rationale for the 30-day hold time, only 30 days for state water? What's the explanation?
You know, that's a great, I don't know what the story is, but that was one that we did get permission during the drought to store water in the lake, but it's just been a standing one. Part of it has to do with confusing steelhead. So we start putting state water molecules in there, it has a different scent to it, and you have the potential of confusing the steelhead that are downstream because we're doing releases. So there's some element of that in that mix. But yeah, I mean, even changing that model to recognize a value, if you have the capacity in the reservoir to be able to store it. I used the words during the drought that the lake had ended up being this hostile location for putting water. And I think starting to put rules in place that would make it less hostile. Of course, the biggest challenge in there is we have a huge user, which are the downstream users, which have a right to store water in the lake, but don't have to contribute anything to the environmental impacts and don't have to contribute anything to the costs. So they get all the value without any of the impacts. And unfortunately, that's an issue that really needs to be revisited at some point with the state board, who has given them a permit that basically a state water rights order that allows them that ability.
Right. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, I'm on. The idea of a letter is an interesting idea, but I would go in a different direction. You know, you have the monthly meeting that the chair and the vice chair of Water Commission meets with our two liaisons,
Right.
Councilmember Sneddon and Friedman. It would seem appropriate that in that meeting, you guys basically talk about how you might approach this issue. Because I think you're going to be looking at staff to staff contact, elected to elected contacts, being much more effective than just a letter from the Water Commission. I think that you guys basically be able to strategize at that level and then bring back to the Water Commission if we have a role in that. I'd look forward to hearing back from your discussions, but I think that's the direction you ought to go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that comment. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so we're at the time for the water.
Chair Keller,
Yes,
we do have somebody who would like to make a public comment on this item.
yes, yes, please.
Charles Hamilton, I have unmuted you. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I think summarize another dimension that I didn't address specifically in my concerns about the reliability of water, and particularly the reliability of surface water and fresh water that depends completely on precipitation. And that has to do with the politics of those other sources of water, over which it's obviously clear now from this discussion, they are very complicated, they are costly. There's nothing in my horizon that tells me this is going to get easier rather than harder. All the more, and I hate to be sounding like I'm preaching, all the more important why I'm so sold on desalination and so thrilled to be living in Santa Barbara where you have it. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. All right, so sorry about that. So let's move on to the final item, the water resources management report.
Chair Keller, Water Resources, Joshua Hybert, Water Resources Manager. And, I really I'll just quickly go through these. I really don't have a lot here. I was going to just point out, again, we've had 0 spills in the wastewater system. We are just absolutely thrilled. It's just so nice to see the payoff from all the investments we've been making. So at this point, given the time we're at, I'd like to just pause there and see if there was any questions on the materials that were sent out. I believe you guys got them yesterday. I know you had a lot of materials to go through, but if there's anything you'd like me to specifically speak to, I do want to let you know the recycled water system has been operating well. We feel like the changes we've made to it are working, but we are planning to take it down in February to do some piping changes
Okay, so I think was there a comment? No. Okay, so I think we're done. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation, and we'll be seeing you in December. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.